Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, there's nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to go. This is a gentle, slow journey through the myths of ancient Greece, told softly and calmly, with quiet tales of gods, heroes, and a world shaped by time and imagination. You can simply listen, relax, unwind, or allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep. Make yourself comfortable, and when you're ready, we'll begin. In the beginning, there was nothing as we know it. No bright sun casting shadows across meadows. No silver moon gliding through the night. No stars scattered like seeds across the darkness. There was only chaos, the first existence, the first breath of all that would ever be. When the ancient Greek poet Hesiod sat down to write his Theogony, the great genealogy of the gods, he began not with mighty Zeus upon his throne, nor with the earth beneath our feet. He began instead with chaos, the vast and silent beginning of everything. This was the foundation upon which all stories would be built, the opening note of a song that would echo through eternity. But what was chaos? We must gently set aside our modern understanding of the word, for chaos was not disorder or confusion. It was not a whirlwind of clashing elements or a tempest of noise and fury. No, chaos was something far more profound, far more peaceful in its strangeness. Chaos was a yawning gap, an opening, a vast and empty space that stretched beyond all comprehension. Imagine, if you can, a place where there is no up or down, no here or there. A space so complete in its emptiness that even darkness cannot exist, for darkness requires something to be dark against, some contrast to give it meaning. This was chaos, neither light nor shadow, neither something nor nothing in the way we understand these words. It simply was. In this primordial state, there was no earth to walk upon. The solid ground that holds us now, that catches us when we fall, that grows our food and shelters our homes, did not exist. There was no sea to sail across, no waves lapping against shores that were not yet formed. No rivers cutting their paths through valleys. No rain falling from clouds. Water itself, in all its forms, had not yet come into being. And the sky, that vast blue dome that stretches above us during the day, that deep velvet darkness spangled with stars at night, that too was absent. There was no air to breathe, no wind to stir the branches of trees that did not exist. No thunder rolling across the heavens. No lightning splitting the darkness that was not quite darkness. In this state before states, time itself had no meaning. How can we measure time without change? How can we count the hours without the sun's journey across the sky? How can we mark the days without the turning of the earth, the weeks without the moon's phases, the years without the season's wheel? Time, as we experience it, requires events, moments strung together like beads on a thread. But in chaos, there were no events, no moments, no thread to string them on. So time was unmeasured. More than that, it was unmeasurable. It was not that clocks had not been invented, it was that the very concept of before and after, of then and now, had no place in this strange and silent beginning. Past, present, and future collapsed into a single eternal instant that was also somehow endless. This timelessness brings with it a quality of profound stillness. Imagine the deepest quiet you have ever experienced. Perhaps it was in a forest after fresh snowfall, when even the animals hold their breath and the world seems wrapped in soft wool. Perhaps it was in the moments before dawn, when night has finished its work but day has not yet begun, and everything hangs suspended between darkness and light. Perhaps it was in a moment of meditation, when your own thoughts grew quiet and you touched, just for an instant, a peace beyond words. Now imagine that stillness extended infinitely in all directions. No heartbeat to break the silence, for there were no hearts. No breathing, for there were no lungs and no air to fill them. No movement at all, for there was nothing to move and nowhere to move to. Just pure, absolute, complete stillness. And yet, within this vast emptiness, within this yawning gap, there was potential. For chaos was not the end of the story but the beginning. It was not absence so much as it was possibility. Like a blank canvas waiting for the first brushstroke, like the silence before the first note of a symphony, like the pause before the first word of a poem, chaos held within itself all that would come after. The universe existed as a pause before form. Think of it as a great indrawn breath, the moment of stillness before creation exhales itself into being. Everything that would ever exist, every mountain and valley, every ocean and stream, every god and mortal, every story and song, all of it waited in that pause, unformed but not quite unreal, potential but not yet kinetic, sleeping in the depths of chaos. This was a time, or perhaps more accurately a non-time, of infinite patience. There was no rush, no urgency, no pressure for anything to happen. Chaos simply existed, content in its own vast emptiness, in its own shapeless silence. It was complete in itself, needing nothing, wanting nothing, simply being in a way that we, who are always becoming, can barely comprehend. And in that shapeless cosmos, in that silent and timeless void, something waited. Not with intention, for intention requires consciousness, and there was not yet consciousness to intend anything. But in the way that a seed waits in winter soil, or a butterfly waits cocooned in darkness, the universe waited in chaos for the moment of its unfolding. There was a perfection in this emptiness, a wholeness in this void that we might struggle to understand. We who live in a world so full of things, so crowded with forms and colors and sounds, might find it hard to imagine the peace of such absolute simplicity. But there was peace there, in the beginning, before the beginning truly began. There was a rest so complete that it contained all motion, a silence so profound that it held all music, an emptiness so vast that it was pregnant with everything. Chaos asked nothing of itself. It had no purpose to fulfill, no destiny to meet, no role to play. It simply was, existing without effort, being without becoming. In this, there was a kind of perfection that the formed world, with all its striving and changing and struggling, would never quite recapture. And so the universe rested in this pause before form, in this vast and yawning gap, in this timeless stillness. Chaos, the first existence, held all things in potential, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when emptiness would give birth to fullness, when silence would give way to song, when the shapeless would take on shape. But that moment, that cosmic stirring, that first movement of creation, still lay ahead in the timeless time of chaos. For now, there was only the gap, the opening, the vast and peaceful emptiness. There was only chaos, the beginning of all things, resting in its own eternal now. From the yawning emptiness of chaos, something began to stir. Not suddenly, not violently, but with the gentle inevitability of dawn following night, or spring following winter. The first presences emerged from that vast and silent gap, born not of parentage as we understand it, but simply coming into being as naturally as breath follows breath. First came Erebus, the embodiment of darkness itself. And alongside Erebus came Nyx, the essence of night. These were the first children of chaos, the first distinct presences in a universe that had known only undifferentiated emptiness. They were the first notes in the cosmic symphony, the first words in an epic that would span eternity. But we must understand what Erebus and Nyx were, and perhaps more importantly, what they were not. They were not gods in the way we might picture them, not beings with faces and forms, not characters who walked and talked and plotted and planned. They were something far more elemental, far more fundamental than that. They were vast presences, forces of nature given identity, aspects of existence that had separated themselves from the primordial wholeness of chaos. Erebus was darkness, but not the darkness we know when we close our eyes or when night falls over the land. This was darkness as a primary quality of the cosmos, darkness as one of the fundamental building blocks of reality. Imagine a darkness so deep, so complete, that it becomes almost tangible, almost solid in its density. A darkness that is not the absence of light, for light did not yet exist to be absent, but rather a presence in its own right, a thing unto itself. This darkness spread through the void like ink through water, not moving but rather being everywhere at once. Erebus filled the spaces between things that did not yet exist, occupied the gaps in a cosmos still learning how to have gaps. There was a weight to this darkness, a substance, though it had no mass as we understand it. It simply was, permeating everything, defining the character of the early universe through its own essential nature. An NYX, night, emerged alongside Erebus. She was distinct from darkness, though the two were intimately related, like siblings who share the same deep eyes, the same quiet way of moving through the world. Night was not simply darkness, but something more. Night carried with it a quality of mystery, of concealment, of things hidden and waiting. Night was the cloak that would one day cover the earth when the sun departed, the blanket that would tuck the world in for sleep and dreams. NYX was vast beyond imagining, stretching herself through the cosmos like a great river of shadow. But her shadows were soft, almost gentle in their obscurity. Where Erebus was the deep darkness of underground caverns, of places where no light had ever reached, NYX was the darkness of closed eyelids, of quiet rooms, of the peaceful hours when the world rests. She was stillness given form, or rather, stillness so profound that it became a presence in itself. These primordial beings, Erebus and NYX, did not act in the way that later gods and mortals would act. They did not have adventures or make choices or pursue goals. They were not actors upon a stage, but rather they were the stage itself, they were the very atmosphere and essence of the early cosmos. Their existence was not something they did, it was something they were, completely and absolutely. Think of it this way, a mountain does not choose to be a mountain, it does not decide to stand tall or to cast its shadow across the valley. It simply exists, and its existence shapes everything around it. Rivers flow around it, winds blow over it, clouds gather at its peak. The mountain changes the world simply by being in it. So it was with Erebus and NYX. They did not shape the atmosphere of the cosmos through their actions, but through their very existence. The presence of Erebus meant that the universe now knew darkness, that darkness was woven into the fabric of reality. Every corner of the cosmos that would ever exist, every space between stars that would one day burn in the heavens, carried within it this primordial darkness. It became part of the foundation, part of the essential character of all that is. And the presence of NYX meant that the universe now knew night, knew the concept of obscurity and mystery, knew the peace that comes when things are hidden from view. Night would become, in time, the friend of those who needed rest, the shelter of those who needed privacy, the cover of dreamers and lovers and all who sought refuge from the brightness of day. Together, these two presences created an atmosphere in the cosmos. Not an atmosphere of air and gas, for such things did not yet exist, but an atmosphere of quality and character. The universe was no longer the simple, undifferentiated emptiness of chaos. Now it had texture, it had tone, it had personality. It was a place of darkness and night, a place of shadow and obscurity, a place of quiet mystery. Imagine standing in this cosmos in those early moments after Erebus and NYX emerged. You would feel, though you yourself could not yet exist, a sense of envelopment, of being surrounded by something vast and ancient. The darkness would press gently against you from all sides, not threatening but simply present, simply there. And within that darkness, you would sense night, that quality of restfulness, of things set aside until another time, of peace and stillness. There would be no fear in this place, for fear requires the possibility of danger, and nothing dangerous existed yet. There would be no loneliness, for loneliness requires the memory or hope of companionship, and no companions had yet come into being. There would only be the quiet presence of these primordial forces, Erebus and Nyx, holding the cosmos in their gentle, eternal embrace. The stillness that had characterized chaos continued, but now it was a different kind of stillness. Where chaos had been the stillness of nothing in particular, the stillness of pure potential, this new stillness was the stillness of night, the stillness of darkness. It was a stillness with character, with presence, with a kind of personality all its own. In this stillness, you might imagine that time began to take on the faintest outline of meaning. Not time as we measure it, with seconds and minutes and hours, but time as a quality of existence. In the presence of night, the cosmos began to know what it meant for there to be a now, even if there was not yet a then or a later. Night suggested, without insisting, that existence might have phases, that there might be times of obscurity and times of revelation, even though such times had not yet come to pass. Erebus and Nyx existed together in perfect harmony, neither competing with the other nor merging completely into one. They were distinct presences, each with their own essential nature, yet complementary, two voices singing in perfect consonance. Their existence together created a kind of wholeness, a balance that would become a pattern for all the dualities that would follow in the cosmos. And still, they did not act. They did not speak or move or think or plan. They simply were, and their being was enough. Through their existence alone, they transformed the cosmos from a simple void into a place of character and atmosphere. They made the universe a place where things could happen, even though nothing was happening yet. They prepared the way, though preparation implies intention, and they had no intentions, only existence. The vast presences of Erebus and Nyx filled the cosmos with a sense of pregnant possibility. Something more was coming, something was gathering in the darkness and night, waiting for its moment of emergence. But there was no rush, no urgency. Erebus and Nyx had all the time in the universe, which is to say, they existed outside of time entirely, in a state of pure being that needed no future because it was complete in every eternal present moment. And so the cosmos rested in darkness and night, held gently in the presence of these primordial beings, waiting with infinite patience for whatever would come next in the slow unfolding of creation. In the deep darkness, in the peaceful night, something new began to emerge. The cosmos, which had known only the yawning emptiness of chaos and the vast presences of Erebus and Nyx, was about to transform once more. Two new forces came into being, and with them, the universe would never be quite the same again. First came Gaia, the earth herself. Not earth as soil beneath our feet, not yet, but earth as a principle, as a foundation, as the promise of solidity in a universe that had known only emptiness and shadow. Gaia emerged from chaos just as Erebus and Nyx had done, born of that primordial gap, that yawning void, but bringing with her something entirely new to the cosmos. Where chaos had been emptiness and Erebus had been darkness and Nyx had been night, Gaia was substance. She was the first solid thing, the first presence that could be stood upon, the first foundation upon which other things could rest. Imagine the significance of this moment, the universe learning, for the first time, what it meant to have a base, a ground, a place from which to begin. Gaia was not merely a planet or a ball of rock floating in space. She was Earth in its most essential form, the principle of groundedness itself, the embodiment of stability and sustenance. She was the mother of place, the origin of all locations, the source from which the very concept of here and there would spring. In her existence, space itself began to take on new meaning, for now there was a center, a point of reference, a foundation from which everything else could be measured. And alongside Gaia came Eros. But we must set aside everything we think we know about this name. Eros was not the chubby cherub with arrows of romance. He was not the god of Valentine's Day or passionate embraces. This primordial Eros was something far more powerful, far more fundamental to the nature of existence itself. Eros was the creative impulse, the force that draws things together, the cosmic principle of connection and generation. Think of Eros as the universe's first yes, its first movement toward relationship, toward combination, toward the creation of something new from the meeting of different elements. Where chaos had been separation, a gap, a void, Eros was the force that would overcome separation. Where the early cosmos had been characterized by distinct, isolated presences, Eros brought the possibility of union, of fusion, of things coming together to create more than the sum of their parts. This Eros was attraction in its purest form, not sexual or romantic, but fundamental. It was the force that would eventually draw particles together to form atoms, atoms to form molecules, molecules to form stars and planets, and eventually life itself. It was the cosmic glue, the binding energy, the great yes that counterbalances the void's eternal silence. With the emergence of Gaia and Eros, something profound shifted in the cosmos. The universe was no longer characterized only by emptiness and obscurity. Now it had foundation and connection. Now it had the earth to stand on and the impulse to bring things together. The change was subtle, gentle, like the first hint of dawn touching the edge of a dark horizon, but it was real and irreversible. This was the shift from emptiness to connection, from void to relationship. In the beginning, there had been only chaos, alone in its aloneness, separate in its separation. Then came Erebus and Nyx, distinct presences but still essentially solitary, existing alongside each other but not truly together. But now, with Gaia providing a meeting place and Eros providing the impulse to meet, the cosmos could begin to weave itself into something more complex, more interconnected, more alive. Slowly, so slowly that it would be imperceptible if there were anyone to perceive it, the cosmos began to gain structure. Gaia, the earth, became the anchor point, the stable foundation around which other things could organize themselves. She was the first instance of order, the first suggestion that the universe might have architecture, might have design, might have a pattern underlying its existence. But this structure did not emerge suddenly or forcefully. There were no explosions, no cataclysms, no violent upheavals. Creation, in these early moments, was organic and quiet, like blooming. Like a seed in dark soil, sending out its first tender root, then its first pale shoot reaching toward light that doesn't yet exist but somehow calls to it nonetheless. Like a flower unfurling its petals in the morning, each movement so gradual that you cannot see it happening, yet when you look away and look back, everything has changed. Imagine a flower opening in time-lapse, each petal slowly releasing itself from the bud, stretching outward, finding its place in relation to all the other petals. There is no force, no pushing, no struggle. Just a natural unfolding, an inevitable expression of the flower's inner nature. This is how creation proceeded in these primordial times. Not through divine command or cosmic violence, but through gentle, organic emergence. Gaia settled into her existence like rich earth settling after rain, finding her form, establishing her presence. she became the dark, fertile foundation of all that would come. In her depths, she held the potential for mountains and valleys, for continents and islands, for all the varied landscapes that would one day cover her surface. But for now, she was simply earth in her essential nature, solid and stable and endlessly patient. And Eros moved through the cosmos like spring moving through winter soil, invisible but undeniable, bringing with him the promise of connection, of relationship, of things coming together in new and creative ways. He was not a being who acted, but a force that permeated everything, a fundamental quality of the universe itself. Wherever Eros was, and he was everywhere, there was the possibility of union, the potential for separate things to join and create something new. Together, Gaia and Eros created the conditions for complexity. Gaia provided the stable ground, the foundation, the platform upon which creation could build itself. Eros provided the impulse to build, the attraction that would draw different elements together, the creative force that would drive the universe toward ever greater elaboration and beauty. The cosmos was learning, in these quiet moments, what it meant to be a place of possibilities rather than simply a place of presences. With Gaia and Eros, the universe gained not just new inhabitants but new capacities. It could now support things, thanks to Gaia's solidity. It could now combine things, thanks to Eros's attractive force. These were the tools from which all future creation would spring. And still, the process was gentle, unhurried, patient beyond all human understanding of patience. There were no deadlines in this cosmos, no schedules to keep, no urgency driving creation forward. Things emerged in their own time, which is to say, in a kind of timelessness where each moment was both eternal and instantaneous, where past and future collapsed into an endless present of becoming. The structure that began to form in the cosmos was like the structure of a crystal growing in solution, each molecule finding its place in the lattice, the pattern emerging not from external design but from the inherent nature of the materials themselves. The universe was discovering its own nature, expressing its own inner logic, unfolding according to principles that were part of its essential being. Gaia, the earth, became the first great teacher of form. She showed the cosmos what it meant to have boundaries, to have an inside and an outside, to have a surface and depths. She was the first thing that could be circumscribed, the first presence that occupied a definite space rather than simply permeating the void. In this way, she gave the universe its first lesson in definition, in the creative power of limits. And Eros, the creative impulse, became the first great teacher of relationship. He showed the cosmos what it meant for things to reach toward each other, to be drawn together, to create something new through their combination. He was the force of synthesis, of integration, of wholeness emerging from multiplicity. Through Eros, the universe learned that connection was possible, that the isolation of separate existence could be overcome. From void to foundation, from emptiness to connection, this was the journey the cosmos had taken in these primordial moments. It had begun as pure potential, undifferentiated and undefined. Now it had darkness and night, earth and creative love. Now it had character and substance, presence and possibility. And like a garden in earliest spring, when the first green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow, the cosmos was coming alive in the gentlest, quietest way imaginable. Creation was blooming, petal by petal, root by root, each element finding its place in a pattern that had no designer but emerged naturally from the very nature of existence itself. Gaia, the earth herself, rested in the cosmic darkness, solid and sure, the first foundation in a universe that had known only void and shadow. Her emergence had been spontaneous, born not from parentage or planning but from the deep creative potential of chaos itself. She simply came into being, as naturally as a thought arising in stillness, as inevitably as water finding its level. There was something miraculous in this spontaneous emergence, something that speaks to the generative power of the universe itself. Gaia was not made or crafted or assembled. She was not the product of divine will or conscious design. She simply emerged, the way a spring emerges from the earth, flowing forth from hidden sources, bringing something new into the world through the sheer abundance of existence itself. And in her emergence, Gaia brought with her a quality that the cosmos had not yet known. She brought nurturing. She brought the capacity to sustain, to support, to give foundation to other things. Where chaos had been neutral emptiness and Erebus and NYX had been vast but impersonal presences, Gaia was different. Gaia was a mother, not in the sense of having borne children yet, but in her essential nature, in the quality of her being. Her presence was stabilizing in a way that transformed the entire cosmos. Before Gaia, everything had been fluid, undefined, without anchor or reference point. But now there was ground, there was foundation, there was a center around which all else could organize itself. Gaia brought steadiness to a universe that had drifted in formless potential. She brought reliability, constancy, the promise that some things would endure. Imagine the feeling of lying on solid ground after being adrift at sea for days. The relief, the security, the sense of finally having something dependable beneath you. This is what Gaia brought to the cosmos, not for any conscious beings, for they did not yet exist, but to existence itself. The universe could now build upon something stable. Creation could proceed from a firm foundation. And Gaia, being Earth, being the principle of generation and motherhood, soon brought forth children of her own. But these were not ordinary children. They were not small or helpless or in need of care. They were, like Gaia herself, vast elemental forces, fundamental aspects of the world that was slowly taking shape. First, Gaia gave birth to Uranus, the sky. Imagine this moment, the earth bringing forth the heavens. Gaia, the solid foundation, producing from herself that which would arch above her, creating her own complement, her own opposite. Uranus was the vast dome that would stretch over the earth, the endless expanse above, the realm of air and space and everything that rises. Uranus emerged from Gaia to be her equal in extent, matching her breadth with his height, her solidity with his openness. Where Gaia was the below, Uranus became the above. Where Gaia was foundation, Uranus was canopy. Together they created the first great axis of the world, earth and sky, the two poles between which all existence would unfold. And Uranus was vast beyond imagining. He stretched himself across the entirety of Gaia, covering her completely, creating the first enclosed space in the cosmos. Before Uranus, there had been no above or below in any meaningful sense. But now, with sky arching over Earth, the universe had dimension, had orientation, had structure in space as well as in substance. Then Gaia brought forth Pontus, the sea. The primordial ocean emerged from the earth, born of her depths, flowing across her surface. Pontus was not like the seas we know today, with their shores and tides and the life that swims within them. Pontus was the sea in its essential form, the principle of flowing water, the vast expanse of liquid that would cover so much of Gaia's surface. Pontus was both child and covering, born of Gaia yet spreading across her, adding a new layer to the developing world. Where Gaia was solid and Uranus was airy, Pontus was fluid, bringing the quality of flow and change and adaptability. He filled the low places, seeking his level, moving in ways that solid earth could not move, complementing Gaia's stability with his own gentle restlessness. The emergence of Pontus meant that the earth now knew water, knew the sound of waves that did not yet crash on shores that were still forming, knew the feel of currents moving through depths that held no fish, no plants, no life of any kind, but held instead pure possibility, pure potential for all the abundance that would one day fill the seas. And Gaia brought forth the Urea, the mountains. These were not individual peaks but the principle of mountains themselves, the concept of earth rising up, reaching towards sky, creating high places and low places, valleys and ridges, the varied topography that makes landscape interesting and diverse. The Urea were Gaia expressing her own capacity for variation, for complexity, for rising and falling, for creating dimension and depth. With the mountains, Gaia showed that Earth need not be flat and featureless. She could lift herself up in great ridges, could create peaks that pierce the sky, could form valleys where water would gather and flow. The Urea gave the world its contours, its textures, its three-dimensional reality. They were the sculptors working from within, shaping Gaia into something rich and varied and beautiful. And so the basic features of Earth were established. There was the solid ground of Gaia herself. There was the sky of Uranus arching overhead. There was the Sea of Pontus spreading across the surface. There were the mountains of the Urea creating height and depth and varied landscape. The world was taking shape, quietly, organically, each element emerging in its proper time and finding its place in the growing whole. But Gaia was more than just a mother bringing forth the features of the world. She was also an authority, a power that would endure through all the ages of the cosmos. In later times, when gods and mortals walked the earth, Gaia would serve as oath-binder, the supreme witness to promises and commitments. To swear by Gaia was to call upon the most fundamental, the most ancient, the most reliable power in existence. The earth herself would witness your oath, and the earth does not forget, does not forgive lightly, does not let violations go unmarked. Gaia, who had existed before the gods, who had given birth to sky and sea, who was the foundation of all that is, she was the ultimate guarantor of truth and faithfulness. This role as oath-binder speaks to Gaia's nature. She was constant, unchanging in her essential being. She was present everywhere, aware of all that happened upon her surface and within her depths. She was just, not in the sense of moral reasoning, but in the sense of natural law, of consequences that follow actions as inevitably as harvest follows planting. Even the gods themselves would swear their most solemn oaths by Gaia, or sometimes by her child, the river Styx, but the power behind all oaths traced back to Earth herself. Gaia was the supreme authority because she was the ground of all existence, the foundation that could not be denied or dismissed or overcome. To break an oath sworn by Gaia was to set oneself against the very structure of reality. In this way, Gaia was not just physically foundational but morally and spiritually foundational as well. She represented stability, truth, the bedrock of existence upon which all else depends. She was the great constant in a universe that would soon be filled with change and struggle and transformation. Gods would rise and fall, mortals would live and die, empires would flourish and crumble, but Gaia would endure, steady and sure, the eternal mother, the everlasting foundation. Her nurturing presence extended beyond her own children to everything that would ever exist upon her surface or draw sustenance from her depths. She was the source of all nourishment, the provider of all that grows and lives. Plants would sink their roots into her soil, animals would graze on the plants, humans would till her fields and harvest her bounty. Everything would depend on Gaia, everything would return to Gaia, everything would be held in her patient, enduring embrace. And through it all, Gaia remained essentially unchanged, essentially herself. She was not a character in a story so much as the stage upon which all stories would unfold. She was not an actor but the ground upon which all actors would stand. She was presence and foundation, mother and oath-binder, the beginning of form in a universe that had begun in formlessness. The cosmos, which had started as a yawning void, had now become a structured world. Earth below, sky above, sea flowing across the surface, mountains rising up to create varied landscape. These were the basic elements, the fundamental features, the skeleton upon which all future creation would hang its flesh. And at the center of it all was Gaia, the universal mother, spontaneous in her emergence, nurturing in her nature, stabilizing in her presence, authoritative in her ancient power. She was the earth, and the earth was everything, the foundation of all that is, the mother of all that would ever be. In the quiet darkness, beneath the dome of sky, surrounded by the waters of the primordial sea, among the newly risen mountains, Gaia rested, patient and powerful, waiting for the next chapter in the slow unfolding of creation. In the stillness of the young cosmos, Gaia the earth and Uranus the sky drew together. This was the work of Eros, the primordial creative impulse, the force that brings separate things into union. Gaia, the solid foundation below, and Uranus, the vast expanse above, came together in cosmic embrace, and from their union, the first divine generations would be born. This was no ordinary coupling. This was earth and sky joining together, the fundamental complementary forces of the cosmos finding each other, creating between them the space where life and consciousness could eventually flourish. When Uranus descended to cover Gaia completely, spreading himself across her entire surface, he brought with him the fertilizing power of the heavens, and Gaia, ever nurturing, ever generative, received him and began to bring forth children of extraordinary power and significance. The first children of this cosmic union were the Titans, 12 mighty beings who would form the earliest divine order, the first generation of gods in the true sense. They were born not as infants but as fully formed powers, each one embodying some essential aspect of the cosmos, each one carrying within themselves tremendous creative and destructive potential. There was Oceanus, the great river that encircles the world, the endless flowing water that marks the boundary of earth and the unknown beyond. Oceanus was vast as the sea, deep as time itself, his waters containing all the potential of liquid, flowing, changing existence. He was movement and boundary both, defining the edge of the known world while simultaneously connecting all parts of it through his endless circulation. And there was Coeus, whose name means questioning or inquiry, the titan of intellect and the axis of heaven around which the stars would one day rotate. He represented the cosmos's first stirring of consciousness, the first glimmering of awareness, the beginning of mind emerging from matter. Crius was born, associated with the constellations and the measuring of the year, bringing with him the seeds of order, of cycles, of the regulated movements that would govern the heavens. And Hyperion, whose name means the one who goes above, the titan of light and watchfulness, though light itself had not yet blazed forth in the cosmos. He carried within himself the potential for illumination, waiting for his time to come. Iapetus emerged, the titan of mortality and craftsmanship, though mortals did not yet exist to know death or to craft anything. He was the principle of endings and making, the understanding that things could be shaped and would eventually pass away. In Iapetus, the cosmos learned that existence might not be eternal for all things, that there could be beginnings and endings, births and deaths. And there was Theia, the titan of sight and shining light, carrying within her essence the brightness that would one day illuminate the world. She was vision itself, the capacity to see and be seen, the radiance that reveals form and color and beauty. Beside her stood Rhea, the flowing one, associated with ease and comfort, with generation and the passage of time like a river flowing endlessly onward. Themis was born, the titan of divine law and order, of natural justice and proper custom. Even in these early times, before laws existed or customs had been established, the myths embodied the principle that there is a right way for things to be, a proper order, a cosmic justice that underlies all existence. She was conscience before there were beings to have conscience, law before there were societies to need laws. Mnemosyne emerged, the titan of memory, though there was not yet much to remember in this young cosmos. But she carried within herself the capacity to hold the past, to preserve what has been, to maintain continuity between one moment and the next. Memory, the foundation of all learning, all identity, all connection between past and future, was born in Mnemosyne. Phoebe came forth, the bright and prophetic one, associated with the moon and with oracular knowledge. She knew things that had not yet happened, held within herself the understanding that time might flow in more than one direction, that the future could reach back to touch the present with whispers of what might be. Antesis was born, the nurturing sea goddess, consort to Oceanus, together representing the life-giving waters, the abundance of the seas, the fertility of flowing streams and rivers. She was the principle of nourishment that comes from water, the understanding that life depends on the flowing, the changing, the adaptable. Finally came Cronus, the youngest of the 12, but in many ways the most significant. Cronus was associated with time, with harvest, with the inexorable movement of moments into the past. He was cunning and ambitious in ways his siblings were not, carrying within himself the seeds of both creativity and destruction, order and chaos. Cronus would play a pivotal role in the stories to come, but for now he was simply the youngest of the Titans, born last but far from least. These 12 Titans were magnificent beings, vast in power and scope. They were not quite the personal gods that would come later, not yet fully individuated personalities with desires and conflicts and stories. They were more like living principles, cosmic forces that had taken on just enough form to be distinct from each other, just enough personality to interact and combine and create. But Gaia and Uranus did not bring forth only the Titans. They also produced other children, stranger and more wondrous still. There were the Cyclopes, 3 mighty beings each with a single eye in the center of their forehead. Their names were Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, thunder, lightning, and brightness. These 3 embodied the powers of the storm, the celestial fire, the brilliant flash that splits the sky. The Cyclopes were master craftsmen, though there was not yet anything for them to craft. They carried within themselves the knowledge of making, of shaping raw materials into tools and weapons of incredible power. They were strength and skill combined, raw power focused through intelligence and artistry. In time, they would forge the thunderbolts of Zeus, but for now they simply existed, potential waiting for purpose. And there were the Hecatoncheias, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers of surpassing might. Their names were Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, and each one had 50 heads and 100 arms. They were strength multiplied beyond imagining, force and power and the capacity for action raised to a level that defied comprehension. The Hecatoncheias represented something primal and overwhelming, the raw power of nature unleashed, the forces that could reshape landscapes and shatter mountains. They were too much, too powerful, too strange even for the young cosmos. There was something almost frightening in their excess, in their overwhelming capacity for action. These children, the stately Titans, the skilled Cyclopes, the mighty Hecatoncheias, represented the early divine generations forming the cosmos. They were the powers that would shape reality, the forces that would establish order or bring chaos, the beings that stood between the primordial emptiness and the complex, populated world that was still to come. Each of them carried within themselves some aspect of what the universe needed to become. The Titans brought differentiation, specialization, the division of cosmic labor into distinct domains and concerns. The Cyclopes brought craftsmanship and the transformation of raw materials into purposeful creations. The Hecatoncheias brought overwhelming force, the capacity for massive change, for upheaval and revolution. Together, they formed the foundation of a divine order, though order is perhaps too strong a word for this early stage. They were more like the vocabulary from which order could be spelled out, the notes from which a cosmic symphony could eventually be composed, the colors on a palette waiting to be combined into a masterpiece. Gaia looked upon her children with the complex feelings of any mother. Pride in their power and magnificence, yes, but also perhaps some uncertainty about what they would become, what they would do with the tremendous capacities they embodied. Uranus too regarded these offspring of their union, these mighty beings who represented the first flowering of consciousness in the cosmos. The universe was no longer empty. It was no longer a place of simple presences and primordial forces. Now it was becoming populated, filled with beings of power and purpose, with entities that had the capacity to act, to change things, to impose their will upon reality. The age of pure existence was giving way to the age of action and consequence. And in the quiet spaces between the stars that had not yet been born, in the darkness that Erebus still maintained, in the night that NYX still spread across the cosmos, these early divine generations settled into their existence, learning what it meant to be, discovering their own natures, preparing without knowing it for the great dramas that would unfold in the ages to come. The cosmos had gained structure with Gaia. It had gained dimension with Uranus and Pontus and the Urea. And now, with the Titans and Cyclopes and Hecatoncheias, it had gained inhabitants, powers, the seeds of a divine society that would shape all future creation. Creation continued its slow, organic unfolding, like a flower blooming petal by petal, revealing ever more complexity and beauty as it opened itself to existence. The cosmos, which had known such peace in its early days, was about to experience its first great conflict. But this struggle, vast as it was, began with something intimate and tender, a mother's love for her child and her determination to save him from a terrible fate. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, had risen to power through cunning and violence. He had overthrown his father Uranus, claiming rulership over the cosmos for himself. But with power came fear, for Cronus had received a prophecy that chilled him to his very core. He learned that one of his own children would someday overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. The cycle would continue, son displacing father, generation replacing generation. Consumed by this fear, Cronus made a terrible decision. Each time his wife Rhea gave birth to a child, Cronus would take the infant and swallow it whole, imprisoning his own children within himself to prevent the prophecy from coming true. One by one, the children were born, and one by one, Cronus consumed them. First Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, goddess of the harvest, then Hera, destined to be queen of the gods. Then came Hades, lord of the underworld, and Poseidon, god of the seas. All were swallowed, all imprisoned in their father's belly, alive but unable to grow, unable to fulfill their destinies. Rhea, the flowing one, the gentle Titan, watched in growing anguish as each of her children was taken from her. The pain of a mother whose children are stolen is beyond measure, and with each loss, Rhea's grief deepened and her determination grew. When she felt the sixth child growing within her, she knew she could not bear to lose another. She would not let this child share the fate of its siblings. As her time drew near, Rhea fled to the island of Crete, to a hidden cave on Mount Ida, where the wild sounds of nature could mask the cries of a newborn. There, in secret, surrounded by protective nymphs and the curettes, divine guardians who clashed their spears and shields to drown out any sound, Rhea gave birth to Zeus. The baby was strong and healthy, destined for greatness, carrying within him the power to reshape the cosmos. But first, he had to survive. Re wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes, making it look like an infant, and returned to Cronus. The Lord of the Titans, in his fear and haste, did not even look closely at what his wife presented to him. He seized the bundle and swallowed it whole, just as he had swallowed the others, believing he had once again thwarted the prophecy. But Zeus lived. Hidden in that Cretan cave, he was raised by nymphs and fed on the milk of the divine goat Amalthea and honey from sacred bees. He grew quickly, as divine children do, gaining strength and wisdom, learning about the injustice that had been done to his siblings, understanding the role he was destined to play in the cosmic order. When Zeus had grown to full strength, he knew the time had come to challenge his father and free his siblings. But he could not do this alone. He needed allies, and he needed weapons worthy of gods. With the help of Metis, the Titan of wisdom and cunning, Zeus prepared a special potion and brought it to Cronus disguised as a cupbearer. Cronus drank the potion, and immediately his stomach began to churn and heave. Unable to control himself, he vomited up everything he had swallowed. First came the stone that Rhea had substituted for Zeus. It would later be placed at Delphi as a marker of this momentous event. Then, one by one, came Zeus's siblings, fully grown and burning with desire for justice. Hestia emerged, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. They had been imprisoned, but they had not been destroyed, and now they were free. The rescued gods gathered together, and Zeus became their leader. But they knew that Cronus would not surrender his power willingly, and the other Titans would stand with him. If Zeus and his siblings wanted to establish a new order, they would have to fight for it. They needed weapons, tools of power that could match the might of the Titans. Zeus remembered the Cyclopes, those one-eyed craftsmen whom Uranus had imprisoned long ago in the deep places of the earth. Zeus descended to their prison and freed them, asking for their help. The Cyclopes, grateful for their liberation and recognizing Zeus's right to rule, set to work in their cosmic forge. For Zeus, they crafted the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure celestial fire that could split the sky and shake the foundations of the earth. The thunderbolt crackled with power, bright and terrible, the concentrated force of the storm made manifest. When Zeus wielded it, the heavens themselves trembled. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, a three-pronged spear that could command the seas, cause earthquakes, and split rock. It was the power of water and earth combined, the force that could reshape coastlines and determine the fate of sailors. For Hades, they created a helmet of invisibility, wrought from darkness itself. When Hades wore this helmet, he could move unseen through the world, hidden even from the eyes of gods. It was a weapon of stealth and surprise, perfect for the one who would rule the unseen realm of the dead. Armed with these magnificent weapons and joined by other allies, including the hundred-handed Hecatoncheias, also freed from imprisonment, Zeus and his siblings prepared for war. This conflict would come to be known as the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians, and it would rage for 10 long years. The battle was cosmic in scope. Titans and gods clashed with forces that shook the foundations of creation. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts across the sky, each one splitting the darkness with brilliant light and deafening sound. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, causing massive waves and earthquakes. The hundred-handed ones hurled mountains like stones, raining destruction upon the Titans. The cosmos itself became a battlefield. Where once there had been peace and order, now there was chaos and struggle. The sky burned with lightning. The earth shook and cracked. The seas rose up in massive waves. It was as if creation itself might come undone, might collapse back into the primordial emptiness from which it had emerged. But slowly, gradually, the tide turned in favor of Zeus and the Olympians. The thunderbolt proved decisive, its power overwhelming even the mighty Titans. The Hecatoncheirs, with their 100 hands, could attack from all directions at once, overwhelming even the strongest opponents. And Zeus's leadership, his strategic mind combined with his raw power, gave the Olympians the edge they needed. One by one, the Titans fell. Cronus, who had ruled through fear and violence, found himself defeated by the sun he had tried to destroy. The other Titans who had fought alongside Cronus were also overcome. The age of Titan rule was ending, and a new age was being born in fire and thunder. But Zeus was not content merely to defeat the Titans. He needed to ensure they could never threaten the new order again. Deep beneath the earth, far below even the roots of the mountains, lay Tartarus, a place of profound darkness and imprisonment. It was as far below the earth as the skies above it, a place of exile and punishment. To Tartarus, Zeus consigned the defeated Titans. They were bound in unbreakable chains and cast into the deep darkness, imprisoned far from the light and life of the upper world. The 100-handed ones were set as guards, ensuring that the Titans could never escape, never again challenge the rule of the Olympians. Not all the Titans were imprisoned, however. Some, like Oceanus, had remained neutral during the war, and Zeus allowed them to keep their positions and powers. Others, like the Titan Themis and Mnemosyne, would even join the Olympians, recognizing that the new order was just and proper. But those who had actively opposed Zeus, who had fought to maintain Cronus's tyrannical rule, those were locked away in eternal imprisonment. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, Zeus and his siblings established their rule. They claimed Mount Olympus as their home, the highest peak in Greece, where they could look down upon all the world. From Olympus, they would govern the cosmos, each taking responsibility for different domains. Zeus himself became king of the gods, ruler of the sky and weather, arbiter of justice and law. Poseidon took dominion over the seas, all waters, and the creatures within them. Hades accepted rulership of the underworld, the realm of the dead, a dark kingdom but a necessary one. Hera became queen, goddess of marriage and family. Demeter governed the harvest and the cycles of growth. Hestia tended the sacred hearth fire, the center of home and community. The Olympian rule was established not through inheritance or simple succession, but through struggle and victory. Zeus had proven himself worthy through courage, cunning, and strength. He had freed his imprisoned siblings, had armed himself with weapons forged by grateful allies, had led his forces to victory against seemingly overwhelming odds. He had earned his throne. And so a new order settled over the cosmos. Where the Titans had ruled with a certain primordial simplicity, the Olympians brought complexity and nuance. They were more personal, more relatable, more involved in the details of creation. They would have loves and conflicts, alliances and betrayals, triumphs and failures. They would shape the world more actively, more personally than the distant Titans had done. The cosmos, which had begun in silent emptiness, which had slowly gained structure and form, which had been ruled by the elemental Titans, now entered its classical age under the Olympians. Zeus sat upon his throne, thunderbolt in hand, ready to govern and protect, to punish wrongdoing and reward virtue, to maintain the order that had been won through such tremendous struggle. And deep in Tartarus, the defeated Titans brooded in their darkness, remembering the age when they had ruled, when the cosmos was younger and simpler, before ambition and prophecy had brought war to the heavens. After the thunder of war faded and the last echoes of battle died away, a profound peace settled over the cosmos. The Titanomachy had ended, the old order had fallen, and now the victorious Olympians faced the great task of governance. The universe needed structure, needed careful stewardship, needed gods who would take responsibility for its many domains. And so, in the calm that followed the storm, Zeus and his brothers made a decision that would shape the cosmos for all time to come. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, gathered together to divide the realms of existence among themselves. This was not done through conflict or competition, but through deliberation and, according to some accounts, through the drawing of lots. Each brother would receive a domain suited to his nature, each would have sovereignty over his realm, and together they would maintain the balance and order of all creation. Zeus, who had led the rebellion against the Titans, who had wielded the thunderbolt with such devastating effect, who had proven himself both powerful and wise, claimed the sky as his domain. The heavens became his kingdom, the air and clouds and storms his to command. From the heights, Zeus would watch over all the world, raining down justice and mercy, punishment and blessing, as each situation required. The sky was fitting for the king of the gods, for it touched everything, covered everything, could be seen from everywhere. Poseidon, mighty and tempestuous, lord of the trident that could shake the earth, received dominion over all waters. The seas became his kingdom, from the shallowest coastal pools to the deepest ocean trenches. All rivers and streams, all lakes and springs, all the waters that flow and move and give life to the world, these belonged to Poseidon. He could raise storms that would shatter ships or calm troubled waters to glass-smooth serenity. He could cause earthquakes with a strike of his trident, for the earth-shaker's power extended even to the ground beneath the waves. And Hades, the eldest of the three, quiet and solemn, accepted rulership of the underworld. His realm was the vast kingdom beneath the earth, the shadowy land where the souls of the dead would come to rest. It was a dark domain, far from the light of sun and stars, but it was no less important than the kingdoms of his brothers. Death comes to all mortals, and someone must rule that realm with justice and firmness. Hades took up this grave responsibility, becoming Lord of the Dead, Keeper of Souls, the final king that all mortals would eventually meet. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were held in common, shared among all the gods. Gaia, the ancient mother, remained the foundation of everything, belonging to no single deity but supporting all of them. And Olympus, the great mountain that pierced the clouds, became the peaceful seat of the Olympian gods, the place where they would gather, where they would make their home, where they would govern the cosmos together. Mount Olympus rose magnificent and tall, its peak often hidden in clouds, existing in that liminal space between earth and sky. It was a place of surpassing beauty, where the air was always clear and sweet, where the temperature was always perfect, where no harsh weather could intrude. The gods built their palaces there, great halls of marble and gold, filled with light and music and the pleasant sounds of divine conversation. This was a peaceful seat, deliberately so. After the chaos and violence of the Titanomachy, the gods wanted a place of serenity, a home characterized by harmony rather than conflict. Olympus became that place, a mountain sanctuary where the divine family could gather, where they could feast and celebrate, where they could discuss the governance of the world in relative peace and comfort. At Zeus's side sat Hera, his wife and queen. She was one of his rescued siblings, sister and spouse both, as was common among the gods. Hera became the guardian of order in her own right, the protector of marriage and family, the one who upheld the sacred bonds that held society together. Where Zeus ruled with thunder and justice from on high, Hera ruled with dignity and authority in the domestic sphere, ensuring that oaths were kept, that marriages were honored, that the proper forms and customs were maintained. Hera's role was vital to the new order. She represented stability, continuity, the sacred nature of committed relationships. She was the queen not just in title but in function, maintaining the dignity and protocols of the Olympian court, ensuring that the gods conducted themselves with appropriate majesty and decorum. She could be fierce in defense of her prerogatives, jealous when those prerogatives were violated, but this very fierceness spoke to her commitment to order and proper conduct. Together, Zeus and Hera formed the ruling couple of Olympus, king and queen, embodying both the active power of governance and the stable structure of legitimate authority. Their throne room in the great hall of Olympus became the center of divine rule, where gods would gather to hear Zeus's judgments, where important decisions would be made, where the business of running the cosmos would be conducted. But the Olympians did not rule as tyrants or in isolation from one another. Instead, they developed a collaborative harmony, each god taking responsibility for their particular domain while respecting the domains of others. This was a new way of governing, more cooperative and specialized than the Titans' rule had been. Athena, born from Zeus's head, became goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, of crafts and civilization. She brought intelligence and skill to the Olympian Council, offering thoughtful advice and clever solutions to difficult problems. Apollo, god of light, music, poetry, and prophecy, brought culture and art, healing and foresight. His twin sister Artemis ruled the wild places and the hunt, protecting young creatures and virginal independence. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam, brought love and beauty, the forces that draw beings together in desire and affection. Mars, though less loved than other gods, represented the brutal necessity of war when wisdom and negotiation failed. Hephaestus, the divine smith, created wondrous objects in his forges, crafting the tools and weapons and ornaments the gods required. Hermes, swift-footed messenger, traveled between the realms, carrying communications, guiding souls, facilitating trade and travel. Each god had their sphere, their responsibilities, their particular way of contributing to the functioning of the cosmos. And while there were certainly conflicts among them, jealousies and rivalries, disagreements and competitions, there was also a fundamental cooperation. They recognized that they were stronger together than divided, that the cosmos needed all of their different gifts and powers working in concert. This collaborative harmony was reflected in the way the gods interacted with the world. They did not simply command from on high, distant and unconcerned. They involved themselves in the affairs of Earth, taking interest in mortals, in cities, in heroes and their quests. They became patrons of particular places and peoples, protecting those who honored them, guiding those who sought their help. The age that followed the establishment of Olympian rule was indeed a calmer era after chaos. The violent upheavals of the Titanomachy gave way to a more stable, if not entirely peaceful, order. The seasons turned in their proper cycles, guided by divine attention. The sun rose and set with comforting regularity. The rains came when needed, the harvests followed the planting, the natural world settled into reliable patterns. This was not to say that everything became static or that challenges disappeared. There would still be monsters to defeat, still be conflicts to resolve, still be problems that required divine intervention. But these were manageable challenges within a stable framework, not existential threats to the cosmic order itself. The foundations had been laid, the structure had been established, and now the work was one of maintenance and refinement rather than revolution. In their palaces on Olympus, the gods lived lives of divine leisure and purpose. They feasted on ambrosia and nectar, foods that sustained their immortality and gave them divine vitality. They listened to the music of Apollo's lyre and the Muses' songs. They discussed philosophy and poetry, strategy and craftsmanship, the great questions of existence and the small details of daily governance. And they looked down from their mountain height upon the world below, upon the earth that Gaia had brought forth, upon the seas that Poseidon commanded, upon the mortals who were beginning to multiply and build civilizations. The gods took pride in their creation, in the order they had established, in the beauty and complexity of the cosmos they now shepherded. Zeus sat upon his throne, thunderbolt at his side but not in his hand, for there was no immediate need for its terrible power. Hera sat beside him, regal and watchful, guardian of sacred order. Around them gathered the other Olympians, each magnificent in their own way, each contributing their unique gifts to the divine community. The cosmos breathed easier under this new rule. Where once there had been the uncertainty of primordial chaos, then the simple but sometimes harsh rule of the Titans, now there was the more nuanced, more engaged governance of the Olympians. They were gods who paid attention, who cared about details, who involved themselves personally in the workings of the world. And on clear nights, if you looked up at Mount Olympus from the lands below, you might imagine you could see a glow from its peak, a soft radiance that was not quite firelight and not quite starlight, but something uniquely divine. It was the light of the gods in their halls, peacefully gathered, harmoniously ruling, maintaining the order that had been won through struggle and was now preserved through wisdom and cooperation. The age of chaos had truly passed. The age of the Olympians, with all its stories and dramas yet to unfold, had peacefully begun. And the cosmos rested, stable and ordered, beneath the watchful eyes of gods who had earned their right to rule and now exercised that rule with growing confidence and care. While Zeus threw his thunderbolts and Poseidon commanded the seas, while great dramas unfolded on Olympus and heroes embarked on epic quests, there were other gods whose influence was quieter, more intimate, more woven into the fabric of everyday existence. These were the gentle gods of daily life, the divine presences that accompanied ordinary people through their ordinary days, bringing blessing and comfort to the simple routines that make up a human life. Chief among these gentle deities was Hestia, goddess of the hearth. She was the eldest of Zeus's siblings, first to be swallowed by Cronus and last to be released, and yet she sought no throne, no grand domain, no dramatic role in the governance of the cosmos. Instead, Hestia chose something far more humble and, in its own way, far more essential. She became the goddess of the hearth fire, the warm center of every home. In ancient times, the hearth was the heart of the household. It was where food was cooked, where families gathered for warmth, where light pushed back the darkness of night. The hearth fire was kept burning continuously if possible, for to let it go out was considered deeply unlucky. And in every hearth fire, Hestia was present. She was the flame itself, the warmth, the gentle light that made a house a home. Hestia never married, never bore children, never involved herself in the romantic intrigues and conflicts that so often occupied the other Olympians. She remained ever virgin, ever peaceful, ever devoted to her simple but profound purpose. In this, she embodied a kind of purity and focus that was rare even among the gods. She knew what mattered to her, and she gave herself to it completely. When a family sat down to eat, they would offer the first portion to Hestia, a small sacrifice of food thrown into the hearth fire. It was a gesture of gratitude, an acknowledgement that the warmth that cooked their food and heated their home was a divine gift. And Hestia, in her gentle way, blessed them in return. She brought peace to the household, harmony among family members, the sense of safety and belonging that makes a place truly home. In the public sphere, too, Hestia was honored. Every city had a public hearth, a sacred fire that burned in the center of the community. This fire represented the unity of the citizens, their shared identity, their common life. When colonists left to found a new city, they would take fire from the mother city's hearth to light the hearth of their new home, carrying Hestia's blessing with them to their new land. Hestia asked for no grand temples, no elaborate festivals, no dramatic sacrifices. She was content with the daily offerings, the quiet acknowledgements, the simple respect of being honored first and last at every meal. In her humility and her constancy, she represented something deeply important, the sacredness of the everyday, the divinity present in the most ordinary moments of life. Alongside Hestia in the pantheon of gentle gods was her sister Demeter, goddess of agriculture and the harvest. Where Hestia governed the inside of the home, Demeter governed the fields that surrounded it, the crops that fed the family, the great cycles of planting and growth and harvest that sustained all human life. Demeter was a mother goddess, deeply connected to the earth and its fertility. She taught humanity the arts of agriculture, showing them how to till the soil, how to plant seeds, how to tend growing crops, how to harvest and store grain for the winter months. Before Demeter's gifts, humans had been hunters and gatherers, dependent on what nature provided by chance. After her teaching, they became farmers, able to cultivate their own food, to settle in one place, to build lasting communities. The rhythm of Demeter's year was the rhythm of agricultural life. In spring, she blessed the planting, encouraging seeds to sprout and young plants to grow strong. In summer, she nurtured the growing crops, bringing rain when needed, sunshine when appropriate, protecting the fields from blight and pest. In autumn, she presided over the harvest, the joyful gathering of the fruits of labor, the satisfaction of bins filled with grain and storehouses stocked for winter. And in winter, Demeter withdrew, mourning the absence of her daughter Persephone, who spent those months in the underworld as Hades' queen. During Demeter's grief, the earth lay dormant, fields bare, trees leafless, nature resting. But this rest was not death, it was preparation, the necessary pause before the cycle began again. And when Persephone returned in spring, Demeter's joy brought new life bursting forth from the earth, flowers blooming, crops sprouting, the world renewing itself in celebration. For farmers, Demeter was perhaps the most important of all deities. Their livelihood, their survival, depended on her favor. They honored her with offerings of the first fruits, with festivals at planting and harvest time, with prayers for good weather and abundant yield. And Demeter, in her maternal kindness, watched over their fields and blessed their labor. But Demeter's influence extended beyond the practical concerns of agriculture. She represented the principle of nurturing itself, the care that brings things to fruition, the patient tending that allows potential to become reality. She was the goddess of all growing things, yes, but also of all growth, the development of children into adults, the maturation of ideas into wisdom, the slow cultivation of anything worthwhile. Moving between the divine and mortal realms, between Olympus and earth, between gods and humans, was Hermes, the swift messenger. Hermes was not gentle in the way Hestia and Demeter were gentle, but he brought his own kind of kindness to daily life. He was the god of transitions, of crossings, of movement from one state or place to another. Hermes guided travelers on their journeys, protecting them from bandits and helping them find their way. He watched over merchants and traders, blessing their commerce, ensuring fair exchange. He was the god of boundaries and the crossing of boundaries, present at doorways and crossroads, marking the threshold between inside and outside, between here and there, between one stage of life and another. In his role as psychopomp, guide of souls, Hermes performed perhaps his gentlest service. When mortals died, it was Hermes who came to lead their souls down to the underworld, who shepherded them through the dark passages to Hades' realm. He made this frightening transition easier, his presence a comfort, his guidance ensuring that even in death, no one had to journey alone. Hermes was clever and quick, sometimes mischievous, but fundamentally benevolent toward humanity. He had given them many gifts: the lyre, which he invented as an infant, the alphabet in some traditions, the arts of astronomy and weights and measures. He was a god who paid attention to the details of mortal life, who understood what people needed to thrive, and who helped provide it. These gods, Hestia, Demeter, Hermes, and others like them, brought divine presence into the quiet moments of daily existence. They sanctified the ordinary, elevated the mundane, showed that the sacred was not only to be found on mountaintops or in grand temples but also in kitchens and fields, at doorways and dinner tables, in the simple routines that structured everyday life. Household worship of these gods was correspondingly quiet and personal. It did not require elaborate rituals or professional priests. A mother tending her hearth fire was honoring Hestia. A farmer planting his fields was serving Demeter. A traveler pouring a libation at a crossroads shrine was acknowledging Hermes. The divine was woven into daily routines so thoroughly that the sacred and the ordinary became almost indistinguishable. This was religion at its most intimate and accessible. You did not need to travel to a distant oracle or participate in a great public festival to encounter the divine, though those things had their place. Instead, divinity met you in your own home, in your own work, in your own daily comings and goings. The gods were not distant and unapproachable, but near and involved, interested in the details of human life. There was a profound comfort in this. It meant that no moment was too small, no task too humble, no routine too ordinary to be touched by divine presence. When you lit your hearth fire in the morning, Hestia was there. When you scattered seed across your field, Demeter watched and blessed. When you set out on a journey, Hermes went with you. You were never alone, never unseen, never beyond the care of the gods. This divine calm woven into daily routines created a sense of peace and security that undergirded ancient life. Yes, there were dangers and uncertainties, hardships and sorrows. Life was difficult in many ways. But through it all, the gods were present, offering their particular blessings, their specific protections, their gentle guidance. The hearth fire burned steady and warm, and Hestia's peace settled over the household. The crops grew in their seasons, and Demeter's abundance filled the storehouses. Travelers found their way safely home, and Hermes' protection saw them through. These were not dramatic interventions or spectacular miracles, but quiet, ongoing blessings that made life livable, that made survival possible, that made the daily struggle worthwhile. In the evening, as the family gathered around the hearth, as the day's work ended and the time for rest approached, there was a sense of completion, of rightness, of being held in a larger order. The gods had been present through all the day's activities, blessing and guiding, and now they watched over the night as well. Hestia's fire would burn low but not go out. Demeter's earth would rest, preparing for tomorrow's growth. Hermes would guard the thresholds, keeping the household safe. And in this quiet divine presence, in this gentle attention from gods who cared about the small things as well as the great, people found not just survival but meaning, not just existence but a sense of being part of something larger, something sacred, something that connected the humblest hearth fire to the great fires burning on Olympus itself. The gods of daily life asked little but gave much. A small offering, a simple prayer, a moment of acknowledgement, this was enough. And in return, they provided the foundation for all of human flourishing, the divine calm that made it possible to live, to work, to love, to build, to hope, to endure. Among all the gods of Olympus, few arrived in such an extraordinary manner as Athena. Her birth was not a birth in any ordinary sense, but rather an emergence, a manifestation of wisdom itself coming into the world fully formed and ready to act. The story of her arrival speaks to something profound about the nature of wisdom and the value the Greeks placed upon intelligence and thoughtful action. Zeus, king of the gods, had taken many lovers and fathered many children. One of his consorts was Metis, the titan of wisdom and cunning intelligence. Metis was perhaps the wisest being in all the cosmos, clever and thoughtful, able to see solutions where others saw only problems, able to navigate complex situations with grace and skill. Zeus valued her counsel greatly, and they grew close. But Zeus received a prophecy, those troubling prophecies that seemed to haunt the ruling gods of each generation. He learned that Metis would bear 2 children. The first would be a daughter equal to Zeus in wisdom and courage. But the second would be a son who would overthrow Zeus, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, and Cronus had overthrown Uranus. The cycle would continue unless Zeus acted. In fear, Zeus made a terrible decision. He tricked Metis into transforming herself into something small, and then he swallowed her whole, imprisoning her within himself just as his father Cronus had imprisoned his children. Zeus believed this would prevent the prophecy from coming true, that by containing Metis within himself, he could prevent the birth of the son who would overthrow him. But Metis, though trapped, was still wise and still pregnant. Inside Zeus, she began to craft armor and weapons for the daughter she carried, the daughter who would still be born despite Zeus's attempt to prevent it. She hammered and shaped, forged and fitted, and the sound of her smithing echoed inside Zeus's skull. Zeus began to suffer terrible headaches. Pain such as even a god had rarely felt pounded through his head, growing worse and worse until he could barely think, barely function. He cried out in agony, and the other gods gathered around him. Finally, Hephaestus, the divine smith, offered a radical solution. He would split Zeus's skull open to release whatever was causing such torment. Zeus, desperate for relief, agreed. Hephaestus raised his axe and brought it down upon Zeus's head with a mighty blow. From the cleft in Zeus's skull, Athena emerged. But she did not come forth as an infant, helpless and crying. She sprang forth fully grown, fully armored, wearing the helmet and breastplate her mother had fashioned for her, carrying a spear, letting out a great war cry that shook Olympus itself. She was magnificent and terrible, wisdom personified, born directly from the head of the king of gods. This miraculous birth defined Athena's nature. She was wisdom fully formed, not learned gradually through experience but present from the first moment of existence. She knew what she knew completely, with the certainty that comes from inherent understanding rather than accumulated knowledge. She was born as an adult, skipping childhood entirely, embodying the idea that true wisdom transcends the ordinary processes of growth and learning. Athena became one of Zeus's favorite children, perhaps because she had no mother outside of Zeus himself. Metis remained trapped within him, her wisdom now part of his own counsel. Athena was, in a sense, purely Zeus's daughter, born from his head, from his very mind. She inherited his authority and power, but she tempered these with her mother's wisdom and thoughtfulness. Unlike Ars, the god of brutal warfare, Athena represented strategic warfare, the intelligent application of force, victory through cunning and planning rather than through pure aggression. She was a warrior, yes, but a wise warrior, one who fought only when necessary and who sought to minimize suffering even in conflict. She preferred to win through wisdom rather than violence, through strategy rather than strength. One of the most famous demonstrations of Athena's wisdom came in her contest with Poseidon for patronage of the great city that would eventually bear her name. The people of this new city needed a patron deity, a god who would protect and bless them, and both Athena and Poseidon desired this honor. The gods decreed that Poseidon and Athena would each offer a gift to the city, and the citizens would choose which gift they valued more. Poseidon struck the rocky ground of the Acropolis with his mighty trident, and a spring burst forth. Water in a dry land was precious indeed. But when the people tasted it, they found it was salt water, undrinkable, useful for sailors perhaps, but not for sustaining a city. Then Athena presented her gift. She touched the ground gently with her spear, and from that spot grew an olive tree, the first olive tree, with silver-green leaves and branches laden with fruit. This was a gift of surpassing value. The olive tree would provide food, oil for cooking and lamps, wood for building and fuel. It would thrive in the dry Mediterranean climate, requiring little water. It would live for hundreds of years, each tree a legacy passed from one generation to the next. The people recognized the wisdom of Athena's gift. While Poseidon had offered something dramatic and immediate, Athena had offered something sustainable and nurturing, something that would support life and culture for ages to come. They chose Athena as their patron, and the city became Athens, named in her honor. The olive tree she planted was said to have grown on the Acropolis for many centuries, a living reminder of her wisdom and generosity. This story captures something essential about Athena. She did not win through force or spectacle, but through thoughtfulness and understanding of what people truly needed. Her gift was practical yet profound, simple yet invaluable. It showed that wisdom is not about impressive displays but about genuine insight into what truly matters. Athena became known as a guide to heroes, but she guided them not by fighting their battles for them but through counsel and strategic advice. When Perseus needed to slay Medusa, Athena advised him to look only at the monster's reflection in his polished shield, thus avoiding her petrifying gaze. She gave him wisdom, not just weapons. When Odysseus wandered for 10 years trying to return home after the Trojan War, Athena was his constant helper. But she did not simply transport him home or eliminate his obstacles. Instead, she sharpened his wits, helped him think through problems, gave him the insight and cunning he needed to overcome challenges himself. She made him more capable rather than making him dependent. When the hero Bellerophon needed to capture the flying horse Pegasus, Athena appeared to him in a dream and told him where to find a special bridle. When he awoke, he found the golden bridle beside him. Athena had made her dream guidance real. But still, he had to use his own skill and courage to approach Pegasus and fit the bridle. Athena provided tools and knowledge, but the hero had to act. This was Athena's way, empowerment through wisdom rather than rescue through force. She believed in the potential of mortals to solve their own problems if they were given the right knowledge and tools. She respected human agency and intelligence, treating mortals as beings capable of wisdom themselves, not just as helpless creatures needing divine intervention. Athena's symbols reflected her nature. The owl, wise and watchful, seeing clearly even in darkness, became her sacred bird. Even today, we associate owls with wisdom because of their connection to Athena. The olive tree, her gift to Athens, represented peace, prosperity, and the rewards of patient cultivation. Her armor and spear showed that wisdom does not mean weakness, that the wise must sometimes be prepared to fight, but her preference for strategy over brute force showed that fighting should be the last resort, not the first. She was also goddess of crafts and useful arts, patron of weavers and potters, of all those who combined skill with knowledge to create useful and beautiful things. Athena valued work that required thought and planning, that took raw materials and transformed them into something of greater value. She honored the intelligence of craftspeople, recognizing that their work was a form of wisdom made tangible. In the city of Athens, Athena was worshipped with particular devotion. The magnificent Parthenon temple crowned the Acropolis, dedicated to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. Like her aunt Hestia, Athena never married, never bore children, remaining eternally virgin. Her identity was not defined by relationships to others but by her own inherent qualities: wisdom, courage, skill, strategic thinking. Inside the Parthenon stood a colossal statue of Athena, wrought in gold and ivory, showing her in full armor but with her spear resting peacefully, her shield lowered. She was ready for war but not engaged in it, prepared but preferring peace. This was the balance Athena embodied: strength tempered by wisdom, power guided by intelligence, courage combined with thoughtfulness. The Athenians celebrated Athena with the Panathenaic festival, a great celebration held every 4 years with particular magnificence. There would be athletic competitions and musical contests, sacrifices and feasting, and a grand procession up to the Acropolis to present Athena with a new robe, woven by the women of Athens with scenes depicting her deeds and virtues. It was a celebration not just of a goddess but of the values she represented: wisdom, skill, civic pride, the life of the mind. Athena showed that wisdom could be a form of strength, that intelligence could be as powerful as physical might, that thoughtful action could achieve what blind force could not. She proved that you did not need to be the strongest or the most aggressive to succeed. Sometimes, often, the wisest approach was the most effective. In her presence, people felt challenged to think more clearly, to plan more carefully, to consider consequences before acting. She called forth the best in human intelligence, encouraging mortals to use their minds, to solve problems creatively, to build civilizations based on reason and law rather than mere power. And through it all, Athena remained calm and composed, never losing herself in passion or rage, always maintaining the clarity of thought that true wisdom requires. She was a steady presence, a voice of reason, a reminder that the mind is humanity's greatest gift and greatest weapon, and that wisdom, fully formed and properly applied, can shape the world without needing to force it. Among the Olympian gods, few embodied such grace and harmony as Apollo. He was the god of light and music, of healing and prophecy, of poetry and reason. Where some gods represented raw power or primal forces, Apollo represented refinement, culture, the civilizing influence of art and knowledge. His very presence brought clarity and order, like sunlight dispelling shadows, like a perfect chord resolving discord into harmony. Apollo's birth was a tale of struggle and eventual triumph, beginning with his mother Leto's desperate search for a place to give birth. Leto was a Titan, daughter of the Titans Coeus and Phoebe, and she had caught the attention of Zeus himself. Their love resulted in Leto's pregnancy with twins, but this blessing became a curse when Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, learned of the affair. Hera's anger was terrible and far-reaching. She decreed that Leto would find no resting place on solid earth to give birth to her children. Wherever Leto wandered, heavy with her divine pregnancy, she was turned away. Cities closed their gates to her. Islands refused her landing. Hera's wrath pursued her relentlessly, and with it came the serpent Python, sent to harass and threaten the suffering Titan. Leto wandered in pain and fear, her time drawing near, but finding nowhere to rest, nowhere to welcome her children into the world. The earth itself seemed to reject her, afraid of Hera's vengeance. But finally, she came to Delos, a small, barren island that was not quite fixed to the ocean floor but floated freely on the waves. Because it was not truly part of the solid earth, Delos was not bound by Hera's decree. The island agreed to give Leto sanctuary, though it feared what might come of hosting the birth of Zeus's children. Leto promised that her son would honor Delos forever, would build a great temple there, would make the humble island famous throughout the world. And so Delos accepted her, anchoring itself for the first time, becoming fixed and solid to provide a stable birthplace. There, beneath a sacred palm tree, Leto gave birth first to Artemis, and then, with her newborn daughter acting as midwife, to Apollo. The moment of Apollo's birth was glorious. Light blazed forth from the infant god, illuminating the island and the surrounding sea. The heavens themselves seemed to brighten. Swans, sacred birds, circled the island 7 times in celebration. Apollo had arrived, and with him came radiance and the promise of beauty. But even in his first days, Apollo knew he had a task to complete. The python that had tormented his mother still lived, coiled around Mount Parnassus near the sacred site that would become Delphi. This serpent was ancient and terrible, a remnant of the older, chaotic age before the Olympians brought order to the world. Python was disorder incarnate, a threat that needed to be eliminated. Apollo was only 4 days old when he set out to slay the python. He was given a bow and arrows by Hephaestus, weapons befitting a god, and he traveled to Parnassus to face the monster. The battle was fierce, but Apollo's arrows flew true. He struck Python again and again, his shafts finding their mark, until finally the great serpent lay dead, its chaos ended, its threat eliminated. With Python slain, Apollo claimed the site of Delphi as his own. This was where the serpent had guarded an ancient oracle, a place where the earth released vapors that induced prophetic visions. Apollo purified the site, established proper rituals and protocols, and created what would become the most famous oracle in all of Greece, the Oracle of Delphi. At Delphi, Apollo spoke to mortals through his priestess, the Pythia, named in memory of the slain python. She would sit upon a tripod over the sacred chasm, breathe the vapors rising from the earth, and enter a trance state in which Apollo's prophetic knowledge could flow through her. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world and beyond to consult the oracle, seeking guidance on matters great and small, whether to go to war, where to found a colony, how to end a plague, whom to marry. Apollo's prophecies were famously cryptic, often seeming to speak in riddles or contradictions. But this ambiguity served a purpose. Apollo offered not commands but insight, not dictates but wisdom that required interpretation. Those who consulted him had to think carefully about his words, had to engage their own intelligence to understand the guidance being offered. In this way, Apollo encouraged wisdom rather than mere obedience. But Apollo was far more than a god of prophecy. He was intimately connected with music, particularly the music of the lyre. The lyre itself had been invented by his half-brother Hermes, crafted from a tortoise shell as an infant's clever creation. Hermes had stolen Apollo's sacred cattle, and when Apollo discovered the theft and angrily confronted him, the young Hermes offered the lyre as compensation and peace offering. Apollo was enchanted by the instrument. He accepted it gladly, his anger melting away at the beauty of the sounds it could produce. The lyre became his constant companion, his sacred instrument. He would play it with such skill that all who heard were moved to wonder. His music could soothe the troubled, inspire the creative, bring harmony to discord. When Apollo played, it seemed that the very cosmos paused to listen, that the spheres themselves adjusted their movements to match his perfect melodies. Apollo became the leader of the Muses, those 9 goddesses who inspired all creative arts. He would play his lyre on Mount Helicon or Mount Parnassus, and the Muses would dance and sing, creating a divine performance of surpassing beauty. Together, they represented the highest ideals of artistic expression, not art for mere entertainment, but art as a reflection of cosmic order, as a glimpse of divine perfection made manifest in sound and word. The music Apollo represented was not wild or frenzied, not the ecstatic, boundary-dissolving music of Dionysus. Apollo's music was measured, harmonious, balanced. It had structure and form, rhythm and melody working together in perfect proportion. It was music that elevated the soul, that brought clarity to the mind, that reminded listeners of the fundamental order underlying all existence. This sense of measure and balance extended to Apollo's role as a god of healing. He could bring disease with his arrows. Plague was often attributed to Apollo's anger, but he could also cure disease, could teach the arts of medicine, could restore health to the suffering. His son Asclepius would become the greatest healer of all, learning the medical arts from his father and developing them to such a degree that he could even raise the dead, though this would ultimately anger Zeus and lead to Asclepius's death. Apollo's healing was not random or capricious. It followed principles, required knowledge and skill, involved understanding the body's natural balance and how to restore it when disrupted. Medicine, as Apollo taught it, was both art and science, requiring both intuitive understanding and careful observation, both divine insight and mortal effort. This measured balance between harm and cure was central to Apollo's nature. He was called the far shooter for his skill with the bow, and his arrows could bring death. But the same god who could kill with his arrows could also heal with his knowledge. He embodied the understanding that the same force can destroy or restore, that poison and cure are sometimes the same substance in different doses, that harm and healing are not opposites but points on a continuum. Apollo represented the principle of measure itself, nothing too much, nothing too little, everything in its proper proportion. The ancient Greeks inscribed this principle on Apollo's temple at Delphi, nothing in excess, and know thyself. These were the core tenets of Apollonian wisdom: moderation, self-awareness, balance, harmony. In his person, Apollo embodied these principles. He was beautiful but not vain, powerful but not tyrannical, knowledgeable but not condescending. He moved with grace and spoke with eloquence. He was eternally youthful, representing the perfection of young manhood, but he possessed the wisdom that usually comes only with age. He was reason and art combined, logic and beauty in perfect synthesis. Apollo's loves and losses showed his capacity for deep feeling despite his association with rational order. He fell in love with the mortal princess Coronis, but she betrayed him, and in his hurt and anger, he had her killed, though he saved their unborn child, Asclepius, from her funeral pyre. He pursued the nymph Daphne, but she fled from him and was transformed into a laurel tree to escape his advances. Apollo wore a crown of laurel leaves ever after, honoring her even in her transformed state. He loved the beautiful youth Hyacinthus, teaching him athletics and music, but accidentally killed him when a discus Apollo threw struck the boy's head. From Hyacinthus's blood, Apollo caused the hyacinth flower to grow, each bloom marked with markings that looked like the Greek letters for alas, a permanent memorial to grief and loss. These stories showed that even the god of measure and reason could experience passion, could suffer, could make mistakes. Yet through all his experiences, Apollo maintained his essential nature. He did not let grief destroy his capacity for joy, did not let loss embitter him against beauty. He continued to play his lyre, continued to offer prophecy, continued to heal the sick and inspire artists. He embodied resilience, the ability to experience the full range of feeling while still maintaining balance and purpose. In the daily lives of the Greeks, Apollo's influence was everywhere. The sun's journey across the sky was associated with him, though he was not originally a sun god. That role belonged to the Titan Helios. But over time, Apollo became so associated with light and clarity that he merged with solar imagery. His light was not just physical but intellectual and spiritual, the illumination that allows us to see truly, to understand clearly, to perceive the deeper patterns underlying surface appearances. Musicians invoked Apollo before performances, asking for his blessing, his inspiration, his gift of moving audiences. Healers called upon him when treating the sick, seeking his knowledge and his favor. Poets claimed him as their patron, attributing their best verses to his divine inspiration. Philosophers honored him as the god of reason and proportion, the divine embodiment of the rational principles they sought to understand. And at Delphi, his oracle continued to speak, offering guidance to individuals and cities, to kings and common people alike. The sacred precinct of Apollo at Delphi became one of the most important religious sites in the ancient world, a place where the divine and mortal realms met, where the future touched the present, where Apollo's wisdom flowed into the world through carefully measured words. Apollo showed that light could illuminate without burning, that music could move without overwhelming, that healing required understanding both harm and cure. He taught that wisdom lies in balance, that excellence comes from harmony, that the highest beauty emerges when all elements are in their proper proportion. He was the god of the golden mean, the perfect balance, the measured response, the thoughtful action. And in his shining presence, the world seemed clearer, more ordered, more beautiful, as if his light revealed not just what things are, but what they could become when touched by divine grace and refined by wisdom. In the quiet moments before her brother Apollo filled the world with blazing light, Artemis was born. She came first from Leto's womb, emerging beneath the sacred palm tree on the island of Delos. And in her very first act, this newborn goddess became a helper, a nurturer, a guide. She assisted her own mother through the difficult birth of her twin brother, acting as midwife though she herself had just entered the world only moments before. This miraculous first service defined something essential about Artemis. From her very beginning, she was a protector, particularly of those in vulnerable moments of transition. Birth is perhaps the most significant threshold any being crosses, that passage from non-existence into life, from the safety of the womb into the uncertainties of the world. And Artemis, in helping her mother and brother through this passage, became forever associated with childbirth, with the protection of mothers and infants, with the guardianship of life's most delicate beginnings. Yet Artemis herself would never bear children. Like her aunt Hestia and her half-sister Athena, Artemis chose eternal virginity, asking her father Zeus to grant her this gift when she was still young. Zeus agreed, and Artemis remained forever maiden, forever independent, forever free from the bonds of marriage and motherhood that defined so many other goddesses and mortal women. But her choice of virginity was not a rejection of life or fertility. Rather, it was an embrace of a different kind of life, a different way of being in the world. Artemis chose the wilderness, the untamed places, the forests and mountains and wild lands where human civilization had not yet imposed its order. She chose freedom of movement over domestic stability, solitude over society, the company of animals over the company of mortals. Artemis became the protector of animals, particularly the young. She watched over fawns taking their first wobbling steps, over bear cubs learning to climb, over all the vulnerable creatures of the wild. She was the goddess of the hunt, yes, but her hunting was not cruel or wasteful. She hunted as a predator hunts, taking only what was needed, respecting the animals even as she pursued them, maintaining the natural balance between hunter and hunted. She demanded that those who hunted in her forests show proper respect. Hunters who killed wantonly, who tortured their prey, who failed to honor the animals they took, these earned Artemis's fierce anger. She was not a gentle goddess to those who violated the natural order. Her arrows flew swift and sure against those who disrespected the wild or who threatened the creatures under her protection. But to maidens, to young girls not yet married, Artemis was a beloved protector and patron. She represented an alternative to the path most women were expected to follow in ancient Greece. Where society pushed women toward marriage and childbearing, toward domestic life and submission to male authority, Artemis offered another possibility: independence, strength, autonomy, a life lived on one's own terms. Young girls who dedicated themselves to Artemis's service would join her band of followers, hunting companions who roamed the forests with their goddess. These were the nymphs and maidens who attended Artemis, running swift as deer through the woodland paths, bathing in clear forest streams, sleeping under the stars. They were required to remain virgin like their goddess, to choose freedom over the conventional life of marriage and motherhood. This was not an easy choice in the ancient world, where a woman's value was often measured by her role as wife and mother. But Artemis protected those who made it, offering them a community, a purpose, a life of adventure and independence. In her sacred groves, away from the demands and restrictions of civilization, these women could be free, could develop their own strength and skills, could live lives of their own choosing. Artemis's sacred groves were places of profound peace and wild beauty. Deep in ancient forests, where massive trees created canopies that filtered sunlight into soft green shade, where springs bubbled up crystal clear from the earth, where deer and other animals could rest without fear, these were Artemis's sanctuaries. Humans who entered these groves were expected to show deep respect, to move quietly, to leave no trace of their passing. To violate the sanctity of Artemis's groves was to court disaster. The hunter Actaeon learned this terrible lesson when he accidentally stumbled upon Artemis bathing naked with her nymphs in a forest pool. The goddess, furious at having her privacy invaded, transformed him into a stag. His own hunting dogs, not recognizing their master in his new form, tore him to pieces. It was a harsh punishment, but it spoke to Artemis's fierce protection of her own space, her own autonomy, her right to privacy and solitude. Moonlit solitude was Artemis's preferred state. While her brother Apollo was associated with the bright sun and the busy day, Artemis belonged to the moon and the quiet night. She would roam through silver-lit forests, her bow in hand, moving with perfect silence through the darkness. The moon itself became her symbol, its cool, reflective light so different from the sun's direct blaze, its phases echoing cycles of change and renewal. In the moonlight, the world transforms. Colors fade to shades of silver and shadow. Everything becomes softer, quieter, more mysterious. The boundaries between things blur slightly. What is harsh in daylight becomes gentle in moonlight. And in this transformed nighttime world, Artemis moved like a shadow herself, at home in the darkness, finding beauty in the night that others might fear. She was often depicted with a crescent moon crown, marking her as a lunar goddess. The moon's cycles connected her to the rhythms of women's bodies, to the monthly flow of blood that marked fertility, to the tides that respond to lunar pull. Though Artemis herself remained virgin, she was deeply connected to the mysteries of the female body, to the cycles of potential that defined women's experience. As goddess of childbirth, Artemis was invoked by women in labor, prayed to for safe delivery and healthy children. The same goddess who protected wild animals in their vulnerable youth protected human infants and their mothers. She eased the pains of labor, guided children safely into the world, watched over the first dangerous days and weeks of life when so many infants died in the ancient world. But Artemis could also bring sudden death, particularly to women and girls. Her arrows could strike without warning, bringing a quick end that was considered merciful compared to slow decline or painful illness. To die by Artemis's arrow was thought to be a relatively gentle death, swift and clean, a sudden transition rather than a prolonged suffering. This dual nature, protector and destroyer, nurturer and hunter, guardian of life and bringer of death, made Artemis a complex and somewhat paradoxical deity. But perhaps there is no real paradox here. Life and death are intimately connected, especially in the wild. The hunter sustains herself by taking life. The mother who births also faces the possibility of death in childbirth. The forest that nurtures also contains predators. Artemis embodied these interconnections, these necessary tensions. She represented stillness and independence in a way that few other deities did. Where most gods were constantly involving themselves in relationships, conflicts, dramas, Artemis stood somewhat apart. She had her band of followers, yes, but she did not seek power over others, did not compete for status among the Olympians, did not engage in the romantic intrigues that occupied so many divine attentions. Instead, she sought quiet wild spaces where she could be herself, could live according to her own nature, could move freely without constraint or obligation. She was complete in herself, needing nothing from others, content in her own company and the company of her chosen companions. This self-sufficiency, this inner completeness, was perhaps her greatest gift and her deepest wisdom. In a world that constantly tells us we are incomplete without others, without romantic partners, without children, without social recognition, Artemis offered a different truth. She showed that wholeness can be found in solitude, that strength can come from independence, that a life lived according to one's own nature and values can be deeply fulfilling even if it does not follow conventional paths. For those who felt out of place in society, who chafed at expectations and restrictions, who yearned for freedom and autonomy, Artemis was a beacon of hope. She proved that there were alternatives, that one could choose a different path and not just survive but thrive. She protected those who made unconventional choices, who valued independence over security, who chose wild freedom over domestic safety. In her sacred groves, time seemed to move differently, more slowly, in rhythm with natural cycles rather than human schedules. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the call of owls in the night, the splash of a deer crossing a stream, these sounds marked time in Artemis's realm, not the clang of city bells or the demands of social obligations. Here, you could simply be, could rest in your own nature, could remember what it felt like to be free. And at night, when the moon rose full and bright over the forest, when silver light filtered through the trees and made the whole world glow with gentle radiance, Artemis would run through her domain, swift and sure, arrow-notched and ready, protector of all wild things, guardian of all who sought refuge from the world's demands. She was stillness in motion, independence embodied, the eternal maiden who needed no one and offered protection to all who honored the wild. In her presence, you could hear the quiet. Not empty silence, but the rich quiet of the forest at night, full of small sounds and movements, alive with its own particular peace. And in that moonlit wilderness, under Artemis's watchful protection, you could find a kind of rest that went deeper than sleep, the rest of being exactly who you are, exactly where you belong, with no need to be anything more or anything different. In the peaceful meadows of Sicily, a young goddess walked among the flowers. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, was the embodiment of spring itself, youth and beauty and potential, innocence and joy. She spent her days in sunlit fields, gathering blossoms, laughing with the nymphs who were her companions, knowing nothing of darkness or sorrow. Her mother Demeter watched over her with profound love, cherishing this bright daughter, protecting her from all harm. But beneath the earth, in the vast realm of shadows, Hades had noticed the radiant maiden. The lord of the dead, stern and solitary in his underground kingdom, felt something stir in his immortal heart. Persephone's light and life called to him from the world above, a brightness that his dark realm had never known. He desired her, wanted her beside him, wanted her light to illuminate his shadowy halls. Hades went to his brother Zeus, king of the gods, and asked for Persephone's hand. Zeus, perhaps unwisely, agreed, giving his consent without consulting Demeter or Persephone herself. And so a plan was made, a plan that would change the world forever. One day, as Persephone wandered through a meadow with her companions, she noticed a flower of surpassing beauty, a narcissus, some say, or perhaps an asphodel, blooming alone, more lovely than any flower she had ever seen. Drawn to its beauty, she reached down to pluck it. At that moment, the earth split open beneath her feet. Up from the chasm came Hades in his dark chariot, pulled by immortal horses. Before Persephone could cry out, before her companions could react, Hades seized her and pulled her into his chariot, and they plunged back down into the earth. The ground closed behind them, leaving no trace except the scattered flowers Persephone had dropped. The abduction was swift and terrible, but what followed was in some ways even more devastating: Demeter's quiet grief. When Demeter discovered her daughter was missing, when the nymphs told her what they had seen, when she realized Persephone had been taken into the underworld, the goddess of the harvest was overcome with sorrow so profound that it transformed the entire world. But Demeter's grief was not loud or violent. She did not rage or destroy in fury. Instead, she withdrew into herself, into a sorrow so deep and quiet that it was all the more powerful for its stillness. She wandered the earth searching for her daughter, neglecting her divine duties, forgetting the crops and fields that depended on her blessing. And as Demeter grieved, the earth began to grieve with her. The change was gentle at first, almost imperceptible. Plants grew a little more slowly. Leaves lost some of their vibrancy. Flowers bloomed less abundantly. But gradually, the transformation deepened. Crops began to wither in the fields. Trees dropped their leaves. The earth became barren, unable to bring forth food, and humanity began to suffer. Famine spread across the world, not through divine punishment but through divine absence, through Demeter's inability to fulfill her role while her heart was shattered by loss. This was the earth's gentle dormancy, the first winter, though it was a winter that threatened never to end. The world learned what it meant to be without Demeter's nurturing presence, without her care and attention. Everything slowed, stilled, waited. It was not destruction so much as suspension. Life paused, holding its breath, hoping for return. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Persephone sat in Hades' halls, grieving her own loss of light, of freedom, of her mother, of the bright world above. Hades treated her with respect, even tenderness, but she was a prisoner nonetheless, taken against her will, held in a realm of shadows and silence. She refused to eat, refused to accept her new role as Queen of the Dead, refusing to participate in this life that had been forced upon her. But Hades was patient, and the underworld had its own strange beauty. In time, Persephone began to see it: the gem-studded caverns, the rivers of flowing darkness, the quiet dignity of the souls who dwelled there. And Hades himself, stern and remote as he was, showed her a kind of somber respect. He was not cruel, only lonely, only seeking companionship in his isolated realm. Finally, whether from hunger or curiosity or a subtle shift in her own heart, Persephone ate. She consumed 6 pomegranate seeds, the ruberid fruit of the underworld. Some say Hades tricked her into eating. Others say she knew what she was doing, that she had begun to accept her dual nature, had begun to understand that she could be both maiden and queen, both spring and darkness. Above, Zeus finally intervened, moved by the suffering of humanity and the pleas of the other gods. He sent Hermes down to the underworld to demand Persephone's return. Hades, bound by Zeus's command, agreed to release her. but there was a condition, an ancient law of the underworld: anyone who ate food in the realm of the dead was bound to that realm forever. Persephone had eaten the pomegranate seeds. She could not fully return. But neither could she be kept completely in the darkness. The world above needed her mother's joy at her return, needed Demeter's blessing on the fields. And so a seasonal compromise was reached, a balance that would shape the rhythm of the world from that moment forward. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades, serving as queen of the dead. For these months, Demeter would grieve, and the earth would sleep, dormant and bare. This would be winter, the time of waiting, of stillness, of seeds sleeping in dark soil. But for the rest of the year, Persephone would return to the world above, to her mother's embrace, to light and life and growing things. And in her return, spring would come, Demeter's joy would revive the earth, and the world would burst into bloom once more. This compromise was not perfect. Persephone would never again know the uncomplicated joy of her maiden days. Demeter would have to endure her daughter's annual departure, would have to release her each year to the darkness. But in this imperfection lay a deeper truth, a recognition of the way life actually unfolds, not in permanent states but in cycles, not in absolute happiness or sorrow but in the rhythm of both. The pomegranate seeds that bound Persephone to the underworld became symbols of this dual nature. Pomegranates are strange fruits, filled with countless seeds, each one wrapped in translucent red flesh that looks almost like drops of blood or tiny jewels. They are fruits of death and life both, their seeds suggesting fertility and abundance while their color suggests blood and mortality. Perfect symbols for a goddess who would rule both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Persephone's story became the center of the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred and secret religious rites in ancient Greece. At Eleusis, near Athens, initiates would gather to participate in rituals that reenacted Demeter's search for her daughter and celebrated Persephone's annual return. The exact nature of these mysteries was kept secret. Initiates swore never to reveal what they experienced, but we know they dealt with themes of death and rebirth, loss and recovery, the cycles that govern all existence. Those who participated in the Eleusinian mysteries came away transformed, it was said. They no longer feared death in the same way, for they had glimpsed some truth about the continuity of existence, about the way life emerges from death just as spring emerges from winter, about the way nothing is ever truly lost but only transformed, waiting to return in a new form. This was the wisdom of Persephone's story: balance, renewal, and inevitability. Balance between light and dark, between the world above and the world below, between the joy of presence and the sorrow of absence. Renewal in the understanding that what withdraws will return, that winter gives way to spring, that grief eventually softens into acceptance and even joy. An inevitability in recognizing that these cycles cannot be stopped or changed, that we must accept both the departure and the return, both the loss and the recovery. Persephone herself embodied this wisdom. She was no longer the innocent maiden who had picked flowers in Sicilian meadows. She had become complex, multifaceted, capable of dwelling in both realms. As queen of the underworld, she was stern and just, ruling the dead with fairness, receiving souls with dignity. As the returned daughter of Demeter, she was joy itself, the personification of spring, bringing life and growth wherever she walked. She learned to hold both identities, to be both queen and maiden, both darkness and light. She accepted the pomegranate seeds binding, accepted her divided year, accepted the inevitability of departure and return. And in this acceptance, she found a kind of power and peace that the uncomplicated maiden she had been could never have known. Demeter, too, transformed through this experience. Her love for her daughter did not diminish, But she learned to release Persephone each year, learned to accept the cycle, learned to find meaning in the rhythm of grief and joy. Her annual sorrow became winter, yes, but a winter that she now understood as necessary, as the earth's time of rest and renewal, as preparation for the abundance of spring and summer. The world settled into this rhythm, Persephone's descent bringing winter's dormancy, her return bringing spring's revival. Humanity learned to work with these cycles, to plant in spring and harvest in autumn, to store food for winter and celebrate the return of growth. The seasons became not just climate patterns but a sacred story, a divine drama that unfolded every year, reminding everyone of the deeper patterns underlying existence. In winter's quiet, when the earth lay dormant under frost or rain, people knew that Persephone walked in the shadowy halls of the underworld, that Demeter mourned her absence, that this stillness was part of a larger pattern. And in spring, when the first flowers pushed through the soil, when trees began to bud and birds returned from their migrations, people celebrated Persephone's return, Demeter's joy, the triumph of life over death's temporary hold. The story taught acceptance of what cannot be changed, recognition that some separations are necessary, understanding that loss and return are woven together into the fabric of existence. It taught that compromise can be sacred, that balance can be beautiful, that the rhythm of presence and absence can create a kind of music more profound than endless presence ever could. And Persephone, walking between worlds, belonging fully to neither but essential to both, became the goddess of transitions, of thresholds, of the liminal spaces where one state transforms into another. She blessed all crossings, all changes, all moments when what was becomes what will be. She showed that transformation, even when unwanted, can lead to a richer, deeper understanding of life's many layers. In the gentle inevitability of the seasons, in the reliable return of spring after winter's sleep, Persephone's presence could be felt, a promise that what departs will return, that darkness gives way to light, that life persists through all changes, renewing itself endlessly in the eternal cycle of loss and recovery, absence and presence, death and rebirth. Among all the mortals who ever walked the earth, few possessed gifts as extraordinary as Orpheus. He was not a god, though divine blood flowed through his veins. His father was the king of Thrace, but his mother was Calliope, chief of the Muses, the goddess who inspired epic poetry and eloquent speech. From her, Orpheus inherited a gift so remarkable that it would make him legendary throughout the ancient world and beyond, the gift of music that could move the very stones to tears. This divine musical heritage set Orpheus apart from ordinary mortals from his earliest days. Apollo himself, the god of music, recognized the boy's extraordinary potential and gave him a lyre, teaching him how to play. But Orpheus surpassed even his divine teacher. He added 2 strings to the traditional 7-stringed lyre, bringing it to 9 strings in honor of the 9 muses, and when he played, the music that flowed from his instrument was unlike anything the world had ever heard. When Orpheus sang and played his lyre, the natural world responded as if enchanted. Trees would uproot themselves and lean toward him, wanting to be closer to the source of such beauty. Rivers would slow their courses, their waters growing still and quiet to better hear his melodies. Wild animals, wolves and lions, deer and bears, would gather around him peacefully, natural enemies sitting side by side, all aggression forgotten in the presence of his music. Birds would cease their own singing to listen to his superior song. Rocks would weep, their hard surfaces somehow softening in response to the emotions his music evoked. Even the winds would gentle themselves when Orpheus played, as if they feared their rustling might obscure a single note of his perfect melodies. This was music as a fundamental force of nature, as powerful in its own way as Zeus's thunderbolts or Poseidon's earthquakes, but gentler, more persuasive, working through beauty rather than force. The power of Orpheus's music was not merely aesthetic. It had practical, almost magical effects. When he played joyful melodies, those who heard felt their spirits lift, their burdens lighten, their hearts fill with hope and happiness. When he played sorrowful songs, listeners would weep, but these were healing tears, the kind that bring relief and catharsis, that help the grieving heart begin to mend. His music could calm the angry, soothe the troubled, give courage to the fearful. It could ease pain, both physical and emotional. It could help the sleepless find rest, could comfort the lonely, could bring peace to the dying. In a world often harsh and difficult, Orpheus's music was a gift of profound grace, a reminder that beauty exists and that it has genuine power to transform suffering into something more bearable. This gift would serve others beyond his own performances. When Jason assembled the Argonauts, the band of heroes who would sail in search of the Golden Fleece, Orpheus was among those chosen for the quest. He was not a warrior like Heracles or a skilled sailor like Typhus. His contribution to the expedition would be of a different nature entirely, but no less vital. During the long voyage, when the Argonauts grew weary of rowing, Orpheus would play his lyre, and the rhythm of his music would help them pull their oars in perfect synchronization, making their work easier and more efficient. When tensions arose among these proud heroes, when arguments threatened to fragment the group, Orpheus's music would restore harmony, reminding them of their shared purpose and common bonds. Most famously, Orpheus saved the Argonauts from the Sirens, those dangerous creatures whose enchanting songs lured sailors to their deaths on rocky shores. As the ship approached the Sirens' island, Orpheus began to play his own music, more beautiful even than the Sirens' song. The Argonauts, entranced by Orpheus's superior melodies, sailed safely past the danger, full of his music rather than the deadly call of the Sirens. This was Orpheus's way, to overcome darkness not with violence but with beauty, to defeat danger not through force but through the creation of something more compelling, more lovely, more true. He proved that gentleness could be powerful, that art could achieve what weapons could not, that the right song at the right moment could change the course of events as surely as any sword stroke. But the greatest test of Orpheus's musical powers, and the story for which he is most remembered, came from the deepest personal tragedy. Orpheus fell in love with a beautiful nymph named Eurydice, and she loved him in return. Their wedding was celebrated with joy, and it seemed that Orpheus, blessed with his extraordinary gift and now with a beloved wife, had achieved perfect happiness. But on their wedding day, while walking through a meadow, Eurydice stepped on a snake hidden in the grass. The serpent bit her ankle, its venom swift and deadly. Before anyone could help, before Orpheus could even reach her side, Eurydice died, her life cut short in the very moment when it seemed most full of promise. She descended to the underworld, her shade joining the countless other souls in Hades' realm. Orpheus's grief was absolute and devastating. The man who had brought joy to others through his music now could produce only songs of sorrow. He wandered inconsolable, playing melodies so mournful that all who heard them wept. The trees that had danced to his joyful tunes now drooped in sympathy. The animals that had gathered to hear him now kept their distance, unable to bear the weight of such sadness. Even the stones seemed to share his pain. But Orpheus was not content merely to grieve. His love for Eurydice was too strong, his need to see her again too great. He made a decision that few mortals would dare. He would descend into the underworld itself, would journey to the realm of the dead, and would attempt to bring Eurydice back to the world of the living. The descent into the underworld was perilous beyond measure. The living were not meant to walk in that shadowy realm. Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades, would tear apart any mortal who tried to enter. The rivers that surrounded the underworld, the Styx, the Akron, the Lethe, could not be crossed by the living. The very air of that place was said to be poison to mortal lungs. But Orpheus had his lyre, and he had his gift. He began to play as he approached the underworld's gates, and his music worked its magic even in that place of death. Cerberus, the fearsome guardian, was moved by the beauty of his song. The great beast's 3 heads ceased their growling, its many eyes filled with tears, and it lay down peacefully, allowing Orpheus to pass. Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx, was stern and unyielding by nature, never bending the rules, never allowing exceptions. But when he heard Orpheus's music, even his ancient, hardened heart softened. He took up his oar and ferried the living man across the dark waters into the realm of the dead. Through the shadowy halls of the underworld Orpheus walked, playing his lyre, and everywhere his music brought something that realm had never known: beauty, emotion, the stirring of feelings long thought extinguished. The shades of the dead, those pale shadows of former people, gathered to listen. They could not remember when they had heard anything so moving. Some say they wept, though the dead are not supposed to weep. Even the tormented souls, those being punished for their crimes in life, found temporary relief. Tantalus, forever reaching for food and water that retreated whenever he tried to grasp them, forgot his hunger and thirst. Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, paused in his labor and sat upon his stone to listen. The Furies themselves, those terrible goddesses of vengeance, felt their eyes grow wet with tears they thought they could no longer shed. Finally, Orpheus came before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld. There, in that dark throne room, he played his most important performance. He sang of his love for Eurydice, of the joy of their brief marriage, of the cruelty of her sudden death, of his unbearable loneliness without her. He sang with all the skill his divine mother had given him, with all the emotion his breaking heart could pour forth. And the impossible happened. Hades wept. The stern lord of the dead, who had seen countless souls enter his realm, who was unmoved by the pleas of the newly dead or the grief of those left behind, felt tears run down his pale cheeks. Beside him, Persephone wept too, remembering perhaps her own abduction, her own separation from those she loved, the pain of being torn from the world above. Hades agreed to let Eurydice return to life. But there was a condition, for there is always a condition in such matters. Orpheus must walk back to the surface, and Eurydice's shade would follow him. But he must not look back at her, must not turn to see if she was truly there, until they both had reached the world of the living and stood once more in the light of the sun. If he looked back even once before that moment, Eurydice would be lost to him forever. Orpheus agreed, though the condition filled him with anxiety. He began the long journey back through the underworld's passages, climbing toward the surface, toward life and light. Behind him, he could hear nothing, the shades of the dead make no sound as they walk. He had only Hades' word that Eurydice followed. As he climbed, doubt began to grow in his mind. Was she really there? Had Hades truly released her, or was this some cruel trick? What if she had stumbled and fallen behind? What if she needed his help but couldn't call out to him? The silence behind him was maddening, the uncertainty unbearable. Step by step, Orpheus climbed toward the light. He could see it now, the entrance to the underworld, the blessed sunshine of the living world. Just a few more steps, and they would be safe. But the doubt had become a torture. He had to know, had to be certain that she was there. At the very threshold, with the sunlight just ahead, Orpheus turned to look back. And there she was, Eurydice, her shade just a few steps behind him, reaching toward him, her face filled with love and hope. For one brief, perfect moment, they saw each other. But they were not yet in the world of the living. The condition had been broken. Even as Orpheus watched in horror, Eurydice began to fade. She was being pulled back, drawn down into the depths of the underworld. She did not reproach him, did not cry out in anger. She only whispered goodbye, her voice barely audible, her form becoming more transparent with each passing second, until she vanished completely, returned to the realm of the dead, lost to him forever. Orpheus tried to follow, tried to descend once more into the underworld, but this time Charon would not ferry him across, Cerberus would not let him pass. His music, which had moved them before, could not move them now. The underworld had shown him mercy once, it would not do so again. He had been given his chance, and he had failed. He returned to the world above, but joy had left him. He wandered alone, playing his lyre, singing songs of love and loss and gentle sorrow. Some say he spurned all other company, remaining faithful to Eurydice's memory. Others say he was eventually torn apart by Maenads, frenzied followers of Dionysus, who were offended by his grief or his rejection of their advances. But even in death, his music endured. His lyre was placed among the stars as the constellation Lyra. His severed head, floating down a river, continued to sing. And his story became immortal, a testament to the power of love, the tragedy of loss, the terrible weight of doubt, and the eternal consolation that beauty, even beauty born from sorrow, can offer to the grieving heart. Orpheus showed that music could open doors that force could not budge, that beauty could touch even the hardest hearts, that art could achieve the impossible, even if such achievements were fleeting. And in his gentle sorrow, in his faithful love, in his songs that moved stones and gods alike, he left a legacy that would echo through the ages, reminding all who heard his story that love and beauty matter, that they are worth any risk, any sacrifice, any sorrow. When we think of Heracles, we often imagine strength, the mightiest hero who ever lived, capable of feats no other mortal could accomplish. And this is true. But there is another side to Heracles' story, one that speaks not of raw power but of endurance, not of violence but of compassion, not of conquest but of patient acceptance of what must be done. This is the deeper story of Heracles, the one that transforms him from a mere strongman into a true hero. Heracles was born with exceptional gifts. His father was Zeus himself, king of the gods, and from that divine parentage came strength beyond mortal measure. But his mortal mother Alcmene also gave him something precious, a human heart, capable of love and regret, of anger and remorse, of all the complicated emotions that make us who we are. His life was marked from the beginning by Hera's jealous hatred. Zeus's wife could not punish Zeus for his infidelity, so she directed her rage at the innocent child born of that union. She sent serpents to strangle the infant Heracles in his cradle, but even as a baby, his strength was evident. He strangled the serpents instead, his tiny hands crushing the life from them. It was his first victory, but it would not be his last battle against forces beyond his control. As Heracles grew, his strength grew with him, but so did his struggles with the darker aspects of his nature. He had a fierce temper, a rage that could overwhelm his better judgment. And in his worst moment, driven mad by Hera's malicious influence, he committed an unspeakable act. He killed his own wife and children in a fit of divine madness, believing them to be enemies. When the madness lifted and Heracles saw what he had done, his grief was absolute. He had destroyed everything he loved most. Many men might have ended their own lives in despair. But Heracles chose instead to seek redemption, to find some way to atone for his terrible crime, to transform his guilt and sorrow into something meaningful. He traveled to Delphi to consult the oracle of Apollo, asking how he might purify himself of this pollution, how he might make amends for what he had done. The oracle gave him an answer that would define the rest of his life. He must go to Tiryns and place himself in service to King Eurystheus for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king demanded. This was the acceptance of the labors, not forced upon him but chosen by him as a path to redemption. Heracles, who could have used his great strength to refuse, to rebel, to carve out his own path by force, instead chose submission, service, obedience. He accepted that he must prove himself worthy of forgiveness, that he must earn his redemption through patient effort over many years. King Eurystheus, a weak and cowardly man who owed his throne to Hero's manipulation, delighted in assigning Heracles seemingly impossible tasks. He hoped to see the mighty hero fail, or better yet, die in the attempt. But what Eurystheus did not understand was that Heracles had already faced his greatest defeat. He had failed those he loved most. After that, no external challenge could truly defeat him. The labors that followed tested Heracles in ways that went beyond mere strength. Yes, he needed his mighty muscles to strangle the Nemean lion, whose hide could not be pierced by any weapon. But he also needed patience to track the beast, to corner it, to wait for the right moment to strike. And when he succeeded, he learned to use the lion's own claws to skin it, turning the impenetrable hide into armor. The lesson: sometimes the solution comes from the problem itself. When he faced the Lernaean Hydra, the many-headed serpent that grew 2 heads for every one cut off, brute force alone was useless. Heracles needed ingenuity and empathy. He called upon his nephew Iolaus to help him, recognizing that some challenges cannot be faced alone. Together they devised a strategy. As Heracles cut off each head, Iolaus would cauterize the wound with fire, preventing new heads from growing. The lesson: cooperation and creativity can overcome what strength alone cannot. The Cyrenian hind, sacred to Artemis, had to be captured alive without harming it. For a full year, Heracles pursued the golden-horned deer, never using force, never trying to overpower it, simply following with infinite patience until finally the exhausted creature allowed itself to be caught. When Artemis confronted him for taking her sacred animal, Heracles spoke with such respect and explained his obligation with such humility that the goddess forgave him and let him continue. The lesson: patience over rage, respect over domination. The cleaning of the Augean stables, where thousands of cattle had left their waste uncleaned for years, seemed designed to humiliate rather than challenge. But Heracles approached it with cleverness rather than resentment. He diverted 2 rivers through the stables, using the natural flow of water to accomplish in a day what would have taken months of manual labor. The lesson: work smarter, not just harder. No task is beneath you if approached with dignity and intelligence. When he had to drive away the Stymphalian birds with their bronze beaks and metallic feathers, Athena gave him a rattle to frighten them into flight, where he could shoot them with his arrows. He accepted this help graciously, understanding that wisdom in the form of a simple tool could be more valuable than strength. The lesson: be willing to accept help and guidance from others. The capture of the Cretan bull, the taming of the man-eating mares of Diom's, the retrieval of the belt of Hippolyta, each labor taught Heracles something new about himself and about the nature of true heroism. He learned that strength must be tempered with wisdom, that power must be balanced with compassion, that the greatest victories often come not from domination but from understanding. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in his final labor, the most dangerous of all, bringing Cerberus, the 3-headed hound of Hades, up from the underworld to the surface world. Many heroes had descended to the realm of the dead and never returned. This task seemed designed to kill Heracles at last. But when Heracles descended into the underworld, he did so with respect rather than arrogance. He spoke courteously to Hades and Persephone, explaining his obligation, asking permission rather than simply taking what he needed. The Lord and Lady of the Dead were moved by his humility. Hades agreed to let Heracles take Cerberus, but only if he could overpower the beast without using weapons. Heracles approached the great hound with caution and respect. Cerberus was not evil, merely doing his duty as guardian of the underworld's gates. When Heracles grappled with the creature, he was firm but not cruel, strong but not savage. He subdued Cerberus through superior strength, yes, but also through a kind of gentle determination that communicated respect rather than hostility. And when Heracles led Cerberus to the surface, he treated the creature with care, understanding that the hound was far from its home, frightened and confused by the sunlight and the world of the living. After showing the beast to King Eurystheus, who cowered in terror at the sight, Heracles carefully guided Cerberus gently back to the underworld, returning him to his proper place, his proper duty. He had completed his task, but he had done so with compassion, treating even this fearsome creature with dignity and kindness. This moment, Cerberus guided gently back to his realm, captures something essential about who Heracles had become through his labors. He had started as a man of tremendous strength but poor control, capable of terrible destruction when his power overwhelmed his judgment. Through 12 years of service, of accepting challenges, of learning patience and ingenuity, he had transformed himself into something more, a hero who combined power with wisdom, strength with compassion. The labors ended, but Heracles' life continued, filled with more adventures, more challenges, more opportunities to demonstrate that he had truly changed. He freed Prometheus from his eternal torment. He helped the gods defeat the giants. He performed countless smaller acts of heroism, always using his strength in service of others, always tempering power with mercy. And when at last his mortal life ended, through a terrible accident involving a poisoned robe that caused him unbearable suffering, Heracles faced even this final agony with courage. Rather than let the poison slowly destroy him, he built his own funeral pyre and lay upon it, accepting his death with the same patient endurance he had shown throughout his labors. But this was not truly the end. Zeus, who had watched his son's transformation with pride, granted Heracles immortality. As the flames consumed his mortal body, Heracles' divine essence was carried up to Olympus in a chariot of clouds. He was welcomed among the gods, given a place at their table, wed to Hebe, the goddess of youth. This was his ascension through endurance. He had earned divinity not through his divine parentage alone, but through his very human struggle to become better than he had been, to transform suffering and guilt into wisdom and compassion. Heracles showed that redemption is possible, that we can atone for even the worst mistakes through patient effort over time. He proved that true strength includes knowing when not to use force, that real power comes from controlling yourself rather than dominating others. He demonstrated that the greatest victories are often internal, conquering your own rage, mastering your own impulses, transforming your own character. His story teaches that the path to greatness is long and difficult, that it requires accepting challenges you did not choose, enduring trials you did not deserve, serving purposes beyond your own desires. It shows that heroism is not about being perfect but about persevering, not about never failing but about rising each time you fall, not about strength alone but about what you do with that strength. And in his gentle guidance of Cerberus, in his year of patient pursuit of the hind, in his humble acceptance of help from Athena and cooperation with Iolaus, in his respect for Artemis and Hades, Heracles revealed that the mightiest hero was also, in the end, the most compassionate, someone who had learned through suffering to treat all beings, even monsters, with dignity and care. This is the deeper story of Heracles, the one that continues to resonate across the centuries, not the story of a strong man, but the story of someone who endured, who learned, who transformed himself through patient acceptance of what must be done, and who ascended to divinity not despite his suffering but because of what that suffering taught him about strength, compassion, and the true meaning of heroism. Of all the heroes who sailed to Troy to fight in that long and bitter war, none faced a more difficult journey home than Odysseus, king of Ithaca. The war itself had lasted 10 years, a decade of bloodshed and struggle far from home. But for Odysseus, the war's end was not the end of his trials. His journey home would take another 10 years, a voyage so filled with obstacles and delays that it seemed the very cosmos conspired to keep him from the place he longed for most, his island home, his faithful wife, his growing son. This was Odysseus's long return, and it became the very definition of the Greek concept of nostos, the homecoming, the return to what matters most, the completion of the circle that allows a hero's story to truly end. But nostos was never simply about arriving at a physical location. It was about returning to yourself, to your true identity, to the life and loves that define who you are. The gods tested Odysseus in ways both spectacular and subtle. Poseidon, angry that Odysseus had blinded his son the Cyclops, pursued the hero with storms and shipwrecks, using the sea's power to drive him off course again and again. But the physical dangers, while real and terrifying, were not the deepest threat Odysseus faced. The true danger lay in forgetfulness, in losing sight of who he was and where he belonged. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus's men consumed the lotus fruit, a food so sweet and so intoxicating that it made them forget everything, forget their homes, their families, their very desire to return. They wanted only to remain on that pleasant island, eating lotus, drifting in pleasant forgetfulness. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force, had to tie them to the benches to prevent them from returning to that dangerous comfort. The lesson was clear: comfort that costs you your memory, your purpose, your identity, is no comfort at all. With the witch goddess Circe, Odysseus faced a different kind of temptation. She turned his men into pigs, stripping them of their human nature, reducing them to beasts. Only Odysseus, protected by a magical herb given by Hermes, could resist her magic. Eventually, he persuaded Circe to restore his men, and she became his lover, offering him comfort and companionship. He stayed with her for a year, and it would have been easy to stay longer, to let years slip away in her pleasant company. But Odysseus's men reminded him of their duty, their need to return home, and finally, reluctantly, he left her island to continue his journey. Even more seductive was Calypso, a beautiful immortal nymph who held Odysseus on her island for 7 years. She offered him immortality if he would stay with her, would forget his mortal life and become her eternal companion. Imagine that temptation, to never age, never die, to spend eternity with a goddess who loved him. But Odysseus refused. He sat on the shore day after day, looking toward the horizon, weeping for his home, for his wife Penelope, for his mortal life with all its limitations and eventual ending. This resistance to forgetfulness, this refusal to let go of his identity and his purpose even when offered comfort or immortality, was Odysseus's greatest strength. He was clever, yes, his intelligence and cunning had helped the Greeks win the war through the stratagem of the Trojan horse. But cleverness alone would not have brought him home. What saved him was his stubborn insistence on remembering who he was and where he belonged. While Odysseus struggled to return, his son Telemachus was growing up in Ithaca, becoming a man without his father's guidance. The palace was overrun with suitors, arrogant men who courted Penelope, consumed Odysseus's wealth, and assumed the absent king must be dead. Telemachus had to watch his mother harassed, his inheritance squandered, his father's memory mocked. But Telemachus's growth over these years was itself a kind of quiet heroism. He learned patience when he wanted to act, learned diplomacy when he wanted to fight, learned to wait for the right moment rather than rushing into hopeless confrontation. Guided by Athena in disguise, he embarked on his own journey to seek news of his father, visiting the courts of other heroes who had returned from Troy, gathering stories, developing wisdom, becoming the man his father would need him to be. Finally, after 20 years of absence, Odysseus returned to Ithaca. But he did not simply walk into his palace and reclaim his throne. He arrived disguised as a beggar, wanting first to understand the situation, to see who had remained loyal and who had not. This disguise allowed him to move through his own home unrecognized, to witness the suitor's arrogance, to test his servants and even his wife. The reunion and recognition between Odysseus and Telemachus was deeply moving. Father and son, who had been separated for 2 decades, stood together at last. Telemachus had been an infant when Odysseus left for war, now he was a grown man. They wept together, made plans together, prepared together to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. But the most important recognition was still to come. Penelope, faithful through 20 years of waiting, refusing all suitors despite enormous pressure, had devised her own clever stratagems to delay remarriage. She had promised to choose a new husband when she finished weaving a funeral shroud for Odysseus's father, but each night she would unravel what she had woven during the day, making the task endless. When Odysseus revealed himself to her, she could not immediately believe it. Too many years, too many false hopes, too much disappointment had made her cautious. So she tested him with a question about their marriage bed, which Odysseus himself had built from a living olive tree, constructing their bedroom around it so the bed could never be moved. Only the real Odysseus would know this secret. When Odysseus described the bed in detail, explained how he had made it, Penelope finally knew, truly knew, that her husband had returned. Their reunion was all the sweeter for having been delayed, all the more precious for having been earned through 2 decades of mutual faithfulness. This was Nostos completed, the circle closed, the hero truly home at last. The story of another hero, Theseus, offers a different perspective on the meaning of home and return. Theseus was the great hero of Athens, son of King Aegeus, and his most famous adventure was his journey to Crete to face the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull monster that dwelt at the center of an impossible maze called the Labyrinth. Every year, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete as tribute, to be fed to the Minotaur. This was a humiliation and a horror, a tribute paid in the blood of Athens' youth. Theseus volunteered to be among the tribute, planning to kill the Minotaur and end this terrible practice. In Crete, he met Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, and she fell in love with him. She gave him a ball of thread, telling him to tie one end at the entrance to the labyrinth and unwind it as he ventured deeper. This simple thread would be his lifeline, his connection to the entrance, his way back out of the maze after he faced the monster. Theseus entered the labyrinth, following its twisting passages deep into darkness, until finally he found the Minotaur. The battle was fierce, but Theseus prevailed, killing the monster with his bare hands or with a sword Ariadne had provided. And then came the crucial moment. He had to find his way out of the maze that had trapped and killed so many before him. He followed Ariadne's thread back through the winding passages, through the countless turns and dead ends, letting the thread guide him safely to the entrance. Without that thread, without that connection to home, he would have wandered lost forever, becoming another victim of the labyrinth despite his victory over its monster. The thread represents something profound, the connection to home, to origin, to the path back. No matter how deep into darkness we venture, no matter how lost we become in the maze of our challenges and struggles, we need that thread, that connection to what grounds us, what reminds us who we are and where we belong. But Theseus's story carries a tragic note. Before he had left Athens, his father Aegeus had made him promise, if Theseus survived and defeated the Minotaur, he should raise white sails as his ship returned, so his father watching from the cliffs would know of his success. If Theseus died, the ship would return with black sails, bringing news of tragedy. Theseus, in his joy at victory and his distraction with Ariadne, whom he had taken with him from Crete, forgot to change the sails. The ship approached Athens with black sails flying. King Aegeus, watching from the cliffs, saw the black sails and believed his son was dead. In his grief, he threw himself from the cliff into the sea, which thereafter bore his name, the Aegean Sea. Theseus returned home victorious but arrived to find his father dead, killed by Theseus's own forgetfulness. It was a bitter homecoming, a nostos tainted by tragedy, a reminder that the journey home requires not just physical return but careful attention to the bonds we hold with those who wait for us. Both Odysseus and Theseus teach us that home is not just a place but a set of relationships, a network of memories and recognitions, an identity that we carry with us and must also return to. Odysseus's nostos was ultimately triumphant because he never forgot who he was, never stopped yearning for home, never accepted substitutes or compromises. Even when offered immortality, he chose his mortal life, his mortal wife, his island kingdom. Theseus's partial tragedy reminds us that returning home requires care and attention, that we must remember our obligations to those who love us, that we can be so focused on our victories and our new experiences that we forget the signals, the promises, the small but crucial details that tell those waiting for us that we remember them, that we're coming back not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. The meaning of home, these stories tell us, is found in recognition and reunion. Odysseus recognized by Penelope through the secret of their marriage bed, father and son recognizing each other despite 20 years of separation, the hero recognized by his faithful dog even when disguised as a beggar. Home is where you are known, truly known, where your identity is confirmed and celebrated, where you can finally remove all disguises and be simply yourself. And nostos, the homecoming, is the ultimate triumph not because it is easy or simple, but because it represents the completion of the circle, the integration of all you have experienced and learned with all you were before you left. You return home changed by your journey but still recognizably yourself, bringing back wisdom and experience to share with those who have been waiting, completing the story that began when you first set out. In the end, both heroes teach us that the journey home, however long and difficult, is worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of patience and endurance. Because home, true home, where you are known and loved and can finally rest, is not just a destination but a kind of salvation, a return to wholeness, a restoration of the self that has been tested and scattered by the world's challenges. And in that reunion, that recognition, that final arrival after long wandering, there is a peace deeper than any comfort offered by lotus flowers or immortal goddesses, the peace of being exactly where you belong, with exactly those who know who you truly are. As all stories must eventually do, the age of gods and heroes began to fade. Not with violence or catastrophe, not with a final battle or cosmic ending, but gently, gradually, like twilight deepening into night, like a song growing softer until it becomes silence, like a flame burning lower and lower until only embers remain, glowing quietly in the darkness. The Olympians, who had ruled for so many ages, who had shaped the world and guided mortals, who had loved and fought and created with such passion and power, began their slow withdrawing. It was not that they ceased to exist, gods cannot truly die, but rather that they stepped back, grew more distant, involved themselves less in the affairs of the world they had so carefully ordered. Perhaps they had grown tired. Immortality, for all its gifts, carries its own burden. When you have seen everything, experienced everything, when the same patterns repeat endlessly across the centuries, even a god might long for rest, for quietness, for the peace of non-involvement. Or perhaps humanity had simply grown beyond its need for such direct divine intervention, had learned enough from the gods' teachings to carry on without constant guidance. Whatever the reason, the gods began to withdraw to Olympus, to retreat to their mountain sanctuary, to spend more time in repose and less in action. Zeus still held his thunderbolt, but he threw it less frequently. Poseidon still commanded the seas, but the waters grew calmer, following their natural rhythms without the turbulence of divine emotion. Athena still embodied wisdom, but she let mortals find their own solutions more often, trusting in the intelligence she had helped cultivate. On Olympus in repose, the gods gathered in their beautiful halls, reclining on comfortable couches, drinking ambrosia and nectar, listening to Apollo's lyre and the Muses' songs. But there was a different quality to their music now, something softer, more reflective, less urgent. These were not the triumphant songs of victory or the passionate melodies of new love, but the gentle music of contentment, of satisfaction, of looking back over long ages with the peaceful perspective that comes when the day's work is done. Hestia tended her hearth fire, as she always had, but even that eternal flame seemed to burn with a gentler light, more suited to peaceful contemplation than to illuminating grand deeds. Demeter watched over the seasons, but they turned now with the reliable rhythm of natural law rather than the dramatic swings of divine emotion. Hermes still guided souls to the underworld, but he did so quietly, efficiently, without the mischievous flourishes of his youth. The gods spoke among themselves of the old days, of the Titanomachy and the battles with giants, of the heroes they had guided and the mortals they had loved. These were stories now, memories, tales told and retold with the comfortable familiarity of old friends reminiscing. The urgency had gone out of things. There were no more great threats to face, no more cosmic order to establish. Everything had settled into its proper place. Above the sleeping world, the stars continued their eternal vigil as silent witnesses to all that had been and all that would be. The constellations the gods had placed in the heavens remained, Orion the hunter, the great bear, the lyre of Orpheus, the crown of Ariadne. These patterns of light had watched the rise and fall of empires, had seen heroes accomplish impossible deeds, had witnessed loves and losses, triumphs and tragedies beyond counting. And still they watched, still they wheeled through their appointed courses, marking time with their rising and setting. They asked nothing, judged nothing, simply bore witness with their ancient, patient light. They had seen the gods in their glory and would see them in their withdrawal. They had illuminated the paths of heroes and would continue to shine long after those heroes' names were forgotten by all but a few scholars and storytellers. The heroes themselves had found their peace, each in their own way. Heracles sat among the gods on Olympus, his labors completed, his redemption earned, at rest at last after a life of constant striving. Odysseus had returned to Ithaca, grown old with Penelope by his side, his wandering days finished, his nostos complete. Theseus had ruled Athens and then passed on, his body laid to rest, his spirit at peace. Even those heroes who had died tragically had found a kind of peace in being remembered, in having their stories told and retold. Achilles, who had chosen a short life and eternal glory over a long life in obscurity, had gotten exactly what he wanted. His name would live forever, his deeds never forgotten, even if his body had long since turned to dust. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, was honored even in defeat, remembered for his courage and his devotion to his city and family. Perseus, who had slain Medusa and rescued Andromeda, had lived a long life and passed peacefully into death, his story complete. Bellerophon, who had ridden Pegasus and fought the Chimera, had ended his days in obscurity, but his greatest deeds remained in memory. Jason, despite the tragedy of his later years with Medea, was remembered for his successful quest for the Golden Fleece. All of them, hero and fool, victor and victim, had played their parts in the great story. And now they rested, their struggles over, their names preserved in the amber of myth, frozen at the moment of their greatest glory or their most poignant tragedy, forever young or forever noble or forever cautionary in the tales told about them. And beneath all the drama of gods and heroes, beneath all the stories and struggles, the seasons continued gently, as they always had and always would. Spring still followed winter, bringing Persephone's return and Demeter's joy. Summer still ripened the grain and warmed the earth. Autumn still brought the harvest and the preparation for winter's rest. Winter still came with its quiet dormancy, its patient waiting for renewal. These cycles did not depend on constant divine attention anymore. They had been established so long ago, had been running so smoothly for so many ages, that they continued now through the sheer momentum of natural law, through patterns so deeply ingrained in the fabric of existence that they needed no conscious guidance. The seasons were like a song that continues to echo even after the singer has fallen silent, like ripples spreading across water long after the stone has sunk. Farmers still planted and harvested according to these rhythms. Animals still mated and bore young and migrated and hibernated in their proper times. Trees still leafed in spring and dropped their leaves in autumn. Rivers still flooded with snowmelt and ran low in summer. The world continued its ancient dance, needing no conductor, following the music written into its very nature. And beneath everything, deeper than the seasons, more fundamental than the gods themselves, Gaia's calm endured. The earth, the primordial mother, the first solid thing in a universe that had begun as emptiness, remained as she had always been, patient, nurturing, constant. She had been there before Zeus and Hera, before the Titans, before even chaos had yawned open. And she would remain after all the stories had been told, after all the heroes had been forgotten, after even the gods had faded into legend. Gaia did not need worshippers or stories or remembrance. She simply was, and would continue to be, solid and sure beneath the feet of whatever creatures walked upon her surface, whether human or something else, whether civilized or wild, whether they remembered the old gods or had never heard of them. She was the foundation that could not be shaken, the ground that could not be lost, the mother who never truly abandoned her children even when they forgot her name. In her depths, she held the memories of everything, the first mountains rising from her surface, the first seas spreading across her, the first plants taking root, the first animals emerging to walk and swim and fly. She remembered the Titans and their fall, the Olympians and their rise, the heroes and their quests, the empires that had flourished on her surface and then crumbled back into her soil. But she held these memories without attachment, without pride or regret. They were simply part of her, like layers of sediment, each age settling over the previous one, building up slowly over time, creating a record that went so deep that no one could read it all. Gaia endured not through effort but through being herself, through the simple fact of her existence, which required no maintenance, no belief, no recognition. As night deepened over the world, as mortals slept in their beds and gods reclined in their Olympian halls, as heroes rested in death or in memory, as the seasons turned and the stars wheeled overhead, Gaia remained, quiet, calm, enduring. The mountains she had borne still rose toward the sky. The seas that had been born from her still lapped at her shores. The forests still grew in her soil, the rivers still carved their paths through her substance, the winds still moved across her surface. And in this quietness, in this gentle fading of the age of myth into the age of memory, there was no tragedy, no loss, only a natural progression, a moving from one state to another as inevitable and as proper as the transition from day to night, from summer to autumn, from wakefulness to sleep. The myths themselves began to fade into night, their details growing softer, less distinct, like objects in a room where the lamp has been turned down low. The gods became more like symbols than persons, more like principles than personalities. Zeus became thunder itself rather than the thrower of thunderbolts. Athena became wisdom itself rather than the wise goddess. Apollo became light itself rather than the god of light. And in this transformation, the myths became more universal, more timeless. They were no longer just stories about specific gods and heroes but patterns that repeated, archetypes that appeared again and again in different forms, truths about the human condition and the nature of existence that transcended their particular Greek origins. The story of Persephone was every story of loss and return, of grief and joy, of the cycles that govern all life. The story of Odysseus was every story of the long journey home, of the struggles we face in trying to return to ourselves and those we love. The story of Heracles was every story of redemption through effort, of transforming ourselves through patient endurance. And so the myths did not die but changed, becoming not historical accounts of what gods once did but eternal stories of what is always true, always possible, always relevant. They faded from the bright particular into the soft universal, from the light of day into the gentle darkness where all stories dwell, waiting to be remembered, to be retold, to illuminate new generations with their ancient wisdom. The world at rest, myths fading into night, gods withdrawing, heroes at peace, seasons continuing, Gaia enduring. This is not an ending but a transition into a different kind of existence, a movement from active involvement to patient presence, from doing to being, from the urgency of myth to the quietness of eternal truth. And in that quietness, in that gentle fading, in that patient endurance, there is deep peace, the peace of completion, of cycles fulfilled, of stories told, of rest earned after long labor. The peace of night falling softly over the world, of stars keeping their silent watch, of the earth breathing slowly beneath us, of all things settling into their proper places, at rest, at peace, complete. And so, our stories gently come to a close. You don't need to hold on to anything you've heard. There's nothing to remember, and nothing to think about. The voices of the myths can fade now, like distant stars softening into the night. If your eyes are already heavy, you can let them rest. And if you drift off now, that's exactly as it should be. I'll be here with more gentle tales, whenever you're ready. Good night, and rest well.